Hey guys, tonight we begin with a faint candle, flame flickering in your mind, a wool blanket tucked around your shoulders, and that familiar, quiet hum of the late night. You're safe, relaxed, hopefully hydrated, and ready to drift off as we slip into one of the most famously ridiculous and tragic chapters in American colonial history. The Salem Witch Trials. Now before you yawn your way into historical darkness, Iris, the vibe, imagine a small Puritan town in the 1690s. It's cold, damp, highly judgmental, and absolutely allergic to fun. Everyone is scared of everything: demons, idleness, gossip, colorful clothing, basically life itself. And into this socially constipated little bubble drops a wave of hysterical panic that turns friends into accusers and neighbors into ghosts. Yeah. Sleepy, candlelit paranoia. Let's wander in. Let's start with Salem, Massachusetts Bay Colony, around 1692. Colonial life in New England wasn't exactly cozy. Forget pumpkins and pilgrim hats. It was more mud, fear, and sermons about eternal torment. Salem Village. Not to be confused with Salem Town, because apparently one Salem wasn't enough, was a farming community full of grudges. People hated each other in that polite, God-fearing way, where you smile at Sunday service, but then immediately write a complaint about someone's fence line to the magistrate. No, they loved grudges. Disputes over land, inheritance, and church factions were basically Salem's local sport. Think of it as Puritan Real Housewives without the wine. Now, in the middle of this human compost heap of paranoia, we meet a minister named Reverend Samuel Parris. He wasn't exactly the town's emotional support pastor, more like a walking tension headache. Parris was ambitious, argumentative, and deeply suspicious that everyone was out to get him, which, to be fair, in Salem they kind of were. He lived with his wife, his daughter, Betty, and his niece, Abigail Williams, a name that should ring some faintly scandalous bells, thanks to a certain high school play you were probably forced to read out loud while pretending to act. Yes, The Crucible was based loosely on these events, though the real Abigail was antia femme fatale. Just a stressed out 11-year-old in a very uncanny town. One cold winter in early 1692, things got weird. Betty Parris and Abigail Williams started behaving oddly. By oddly I mean screaming out of nowhere, contorting their bodies like they were auditioning for The Exorcist, and complaining that invisible things were biting or pinching them. At first, everyone just thought it was childhood drama, cabin fever, or, the crushing anxiety of being a Puritan. But soon, more girls joined in. Lycan Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Wall, and Elizabeth Hubbard. Te afflicted girls, Salem's original influencers, in the worst possible sense. Wherever they went, hysteria followed. They shouted, barked, fell into trances, and claimed to see specters tormenting them. And the adults did what adults do best in a moral panic: completely lose it. Doctors were called. The one who examined the girls said there was no natural cause. And that, obviously, meant witchcraft. Because the only thing worse than not knowing what's wrong was admitting you didn't know what's wrong. And here's where things start to spiral. The girls were pressed to reveal who was tormenting them, who was sending these specters to bite, pinch, and choke. On their presser, and maybe realizing how much power they suddenly had, they named names. First came Reberen Paris S., enslaved woman from the Caribbean. Then Sarah Good, a homeless beggar. And Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman with a reputation for skipping church and living scandalously by Puritan standards, which means she occasionally touched property paperwork without a male present. 3 women, all outsiders, all easy targets. On March 1st, 1692, they were hauled in for examination before local magistrates, Jonathan Corwin and John Hawthorne. Yes, the ancestor of Nathaniel Hawthorne, who later added a W to his name to distance himself from this little family embarrassment. Probably a good call. Picture the scene: a chilly meeting house, dark wooden benches, the smell of fear and wet wool. The accused stood trembling as the girls screamed and flailed dramatically, claiming that invisible spirits sent by the accused were pinching and biting them right there in court. It was a kind of performance that would make modern reality TV look restrained. Sarah Good denied everything. Sarah Osborne barely spoke. She was physically weak, already ill. But Tituba, well, she was cornered. And when you're enslaved, poor and alone, confessing might seem safer than resisting. So she did confess, in the most imaginative way possible. She told the magistrates wild stories about signing the devil's book, seeing black dogs and red cats, and flying through the air. She even claimed there were other witches in Salem working with her. You can almost hear the collective gasp. The officials thought, perfect. Confirmation. Proof. Case closed. Tituba's confession was the spark that set off the wildfire. If there were more witches out there, they needed to be found. And suddenly, Salem turned from a churchy farm village into a full-blown witch-hunting machine. Over the next months, accusations multiplied like rabbits. Old grudges came out of storage. The Putnams accused the Nurse family. The Nurse family fired back, and everyone else quietly panicked, wondering if simply owning a slightly weird cat was enough to get arrested. Spoiler: it kinda was. The afflicted girls would cry out in court, pointing dramatically, "There's her specter." Each scream would ripple through the crowd like a contagious sigh of relief. "Thank God it's not me," followed by the uneasy thought that next time it might be BT's spring of 1692. Dozens were in jail. The little wooden jail cell was overflowing. Chains clinked. Children were imprisoned alongside their mothers. Goats probably had more personal space than the witches. And the legal process, let's just say, not exactly airtight. The main evidence was spectral evidence. Basically, testimony that someone's spirit was seen harming people, even if their physical body was nowhere near the scene. It was as if nightmares counted as witnesses. But two Puritans. This made sense, in the same way that a fever dream might make sense at 3 a.m. The devil was real. They reasoned, and so were his agents. That was super risky. But faith won over logic. Justice became performance art. By June, things escalated to the point of executions. The first to hang was Bridget Bishop, a twice-married tavern owner known for wearing bright clothes. Yes, red ribbons were apparently witch behavior. She was executed on June 10, 1692, at a site now known as Gallows Hill. Her trial was hardly fair. Supposedly, witnesses saw puppets or dolls hidden in her home, and one man claimed he felt her specter sitting on his chest. The logic was creatively alarming. But after her death, no one felt safer. The exact opposite happened. Panic just grew stronger. If one witch could die and the fits continued, there must be more. Always more. By midsummer, prominent citizens were accused. Rebecca Norsay, a respected, elderly woman, was arrested. Martha Corey, who'd publicly doubted the trials, was arrested too. Even the former minister, George Burroughs, became a target. Salem had a twisted sense of irony. His execution included him flawlessly reciting the Lord's Prayer, which witches supposedly couldn't do. People were stunned, but still, they killed him anyway. Because, well, momentum. Let's float gently here, because I know it's dark, and in that world of endless suspicion, every friendship cracked. Every act of kindness had its risks. Husbands turned on wives, daughters pointed fingers at mothers, and kids even claimed their dogs were possessed. It was hysteria pressed into a legal shape, given teeth, and told to bite. The trials continued through the summer and fall of 1692, with about 200 people accused and 19 hanged. One man, Giles Corey, refused to plead either guilty or not guilty. He simply stayed silent, because both choices would have condemned him either way. The court ordered him pressed under heavy stones, a medieval punishment, even by Puritan standards. His last words, historically or romantically imagined, were more weight. Very metal. So sad, right? By September, cracks started showing in the judicial system, and even some Puritan leaders began to question the use of spectral evidence. The governor's own wife was named as a possible witch, which, amazingly, made him suddenly rethink his policies. By early October, he prohibited further arrests, and dissolved the special court. Over time, confessions were recanted, apologies whispered, and the girls stopped their fits, though whether from guilt, exhaustion, or boredom, no one knows Tidaba. After all, the chaos she unintentionally sparked was never executed. She spent months in prison until someone we don't even know who paid her jail fees and took her away. She vanished from record, a quiet, uncertain ending to someone who became the story's unwilling epicenter. Years later, the community tried to heal. Jurors wanted forgiveness, and judges admitted their mistakes. It's all about owning up, right? Samuel Paris eventually left Salem, apparently realizing he'd become the least popular man in New England. Impressive competition. And in 1706, Ann Putnam Jr., one of the original afflicted girls, publicly apologized, saying she had been deluded by Satan. The town accepted, but the damage lingered like a ghost that refused to leave the parlor. By the 19th century, the Salem Witch Trials were already legend, a cautionary tale, an allegory, and a convenient metaphor for basically any moral panic that comes along. We love blaming witches, whether real or metaphorical. It's easier than facing what fear does to us. But the real horror of Salem isn't supernatural. It's bureaucratic, ordinary people, convinced they were righteous, destroying lives with full community support. A small town trying to fight its own boredom, guilt, and superstition, and losing. So tonight, as you drift, remember them not as monsters or fools, but as frightened humans inside a snow globe of religion, grief, and suspicion, shaking it harder and harder until it shattered. Feuds hey. Again. Still awake. Good! Welcome back to the icy swamps of colonial paranoia, where everyone wore too many layers, worked too hard, and trusted their neighbors about as much as they trusted the devil, which, ironically, was quite a lot. Tonight, we sink a bit deeper into the background of the Salem Witch Trials. Not the broomsticks and spells, but the soil that grew them. Because, as it turns out, witch hunts don't just appear out of thin air. They take decades of slow-boiling tension, a few dozen grudges, and one very unlucky winter. Let's start with the Puritans themselves, the spiritual heart of this whole disaster. These were people who left England because they thought the Church of England was too lenient, too fancy, too fun. The Puritans' entire aesthetic could be summed up as, no, thank you, we prefer suffering. They prayed hard, worked at ardor, and distrusted anything resembling pleasure. If a Puritan ever smiled, it was probably by accident. Their community rules came straight from their theology, strict, sober, and suspicious. God was everywhere. The devil was too, and everything from a bad crop to a stubbed toe could be divine punishment. Life was one long spiritual obstacle course, and if you failed, you didn't just embarrass yourself, you embarrassed the entire colony. So when things started going wrong in Salem, the residents didn't exactly reach for scientific explanations. They went straight for moral failure. Always easier to blame witches than admit you planted your corn rows backward. Now, Puritan society wasn't just religious. It was also deeply political and fractious. Salem Village was basically the moody younger sibling of Salem Town. The town was wealthier, full of merchants and tradesmen who believed in markets and mild laughter. The village, on the other hand, was mostly farmers poorer, isolated, a bit jealous, and absolutely certain that the town was morally decaying. Rabban Paris, our previous episode's anxious preacher, stood right in the middle of this division. Half his congregation didn't even want him there. The other half was too busy fighting lawsuits to attend services. The man couldn't win, and under constant scrutiny, he became defensive and paranoid, traits you really want in a community leader with free access to public sermons. So when a few girls in his parsonage started collapsing and convulsing, what Paris saw wasn't illness or trauma. He saw spiritual warfare and, conveniently, proof that his enemies were agents of Satan. Imagine the satisfaction, years of being undermined, and suddenly the devil himself was on your side of the argument. To make things worse, the Putnam family played a leading role in steering the chaos. Thomas Putnam was old money by colonial standards, which Hyacinthe Saling Much But he had grievances stacked higher than his fence posts. He hated the townfolk, feuded with neighbors over property lines, and loved a good moral crusade. His daughter Anne became one of the most energetic accusers, naming dozens of supposed witches. Strange coincidence. Right, most of their land disputes overlapped with families she accused. History has its receipts. The Putnam's enemies, like the porters and the nurses, were portrayed as morally suspect. Rebecca Norse, for example, was one of the gentlest souls in the colony, elderly, deaf, and known for her kindness. So naturally, the community accused her of consorting with Satan. That's the level of logic we're dealing with. When people scythe evil walked among them, they usually meant someone got more land than me. Then there was the economic backdrop. The late 1680s and early 1690s were rough times for Massachusetts Bay Colony. Currency shortage, failing harvests, threats from Native American raids up north. On top of that, the colony had lost its original royal charter. Essentially, the entire political system was in limbo, and people didn't like that. When humans feel powerless, they crave simple explanations and simpler villains. Add an unusually harsh winter, a few spoiled crops, and ministers preaching about the devil's war on New England, and you've got yourself a perfect storm of hysteria. Some historians have even floated the theory that ergot fungus found in rye that can cause hallucinations played a role in the girl's symptoms. But whether it was moldy bread or mass guilt, the people didn't need much convincing. Once the idea of witches took root, reason didn't stand a chance. The legal system of 1692 didn't exactly help. Remember spectral evidence, that lovely concept that allowed people to accuse someone based solely on visions or dreams? Imagine a modern courtroom where someone says, "I saw their ghost on my Wi-Fi last night," and the judge nods solemnly before signing a warrant. That was essentially how Salem operated for months. One particularly entertaining example. A man claimed that a witch's specter told him to sign the devil's book, but he refused. The magistrates treated this imaginary dialogue as respectable testimony. It's both absurd and tragic because it worked. Dozens were locked away on nothing more than frightened improvisation, and the prisons were nightmares of their own. People paid for their own chains, their own food, and their own straw bedding. If you couldn't afford that, you either starved or froze while waiting on divine justice. By summer, even the jailers realized this was unsustainable. The economy of guilt had real financial costs. Meanwhile, the clergy squabbled. Cotton Mather, the most famous minister in the colony, believed the devil was real but insisted on caution. Physical evidence, careful trials, mercy where possible. Unfortunately, his measured tone didn't carry far in a frenzy. His father, Increase Mather, eventually condemned spectral evidence altogether. But by then, 19 people were dead. Bureaucracy moves fast, right, until it really matters. What makes the Matta's involvement deeply ironic is their own obsession with influence. They saw the trials as validation of their warnings, that New England's souls were at stake. Specters were proof that spiritual neglect invited Satan's chaos. And while they didn't directly order executions, their sermons flamed the social fever. Even when they preached restraint, they did it in the key of apocalypse. There's an odd, quiet horror in realizing how ordinary all this was. No grand conspiracies. No real witchcraft. Just frightened people following procedure, convinced they were doing moral work. The judges we often condemn weren't sneering. Villains, they were respected men, well-read, pious, and utterly blind to their own absurdity. When one girl pointed to an accused woman and screamed, the magistrates saw not childish theater, but cosmic evidence. George Corwin, the sheriff, even developed a small fortune collecting fees from accused families' payment for taking and returning their property if they survived long enough to reclaim it. Fear was profitable. That's always been humanity's quiet side hustle. By midsummer 1692, the machinery was automatic. Accuse, imprison, examine, repeat. Town after town started seeing miniature versions of Salem's panic, though none reached the same intensity. Some ministers publicly doubted the pattern of trials. A few brave voices like Reverend Samuel Willard called the whole process but the idea of stopping the trials felt dangerous. What if there really were witches? No one wanted to risk being the next on the list. Still, beneath the surface, the community was cracking. Families were divided, farms neglected, and harvests failed again. Even the afflicted girls, once so commanding, began losing their grip on the narrative. Every new accusation made the older ones look weaker, and when the governor's wife got Namdius, the most politically inconvenient target imaginable, the whole machine sputtered. Governor William Phipps pulled the plug on the special court in October. The trials stopped, but the damage had already carved deep scars. 200 people accused, 19 hanged, 1 crushed, several dead in prison, countless reputations permanently ruined. Over the next decade, the community attempted damage control. Jurors published apologies. Judges repented. A few families received small compensation payments, though by small, we mean barely enough to replace the livestock they lost. The colony declared fasting days, as if hunger might cleanse the collective guilt, and for the rest of their lives, the survivors lived in quiet shame, pretending that the devil had fooled everyone equally. The trials faded slowly, remembered mostly by ministers who turned them into cautionary tales. But beneath that moral wrapping, the emotional wreckage lingered. Even the children who once shrieked in fits went on to lead small, haunted lives, marrying quietly, moving away, rarely speaking of what happened. Salem, frankly, wanted to forget itself. As for modern visitors, Salem has rebuilt its image around the myth and irony of it all. Tourists buy witch hats on the same streets where people were once terrified to sneeze wrong. Museums honor the accused. Reenactments entertain the curious. And every Halloween, the town glows with an uneasy blend of tragedy and kitsch. Because time does strange things, it transforms moral panic into commerce, grief into storytelling, and fear into folklore. But when the night is quiet enough, and someone mentions Salem, there's still that echo, a reminder of how fast good intentions can rot once fear takes the wheel. That's what really happened, not sorcery, but systemic madness polished into law. Hey again, dream traveler. If you're still awake, that means you've survived Puritan politics, and the sound of everyone in 1692 aggressively judging their neighbors. Impressive. Tonight, we drift through the aftermath. The eerie quiet after the panic, when the smoke clears, but the guilt stays behind, curling in the corners like fog. Salem didn't die after 1692. It simply changed shape. The ghosts got quieter, but they never really left. Let's start with the immediate fallout, the morning after hysteria. Imagine waking up one day and realizing half your congregation just executed the other half. That's Salem, circa late 1692. The trials ended, the hunt was over, and everyone suddenly noticed how absurd it all had become. The fits had stopped, the devil hadn't been defeated, and there was no grand revelation, just shame. Heavy, silent, communal shame. The courts tried to tidy things up. In January 1693, Governor William Phipps officially pardoned the remaining prisoners and declared no more witchcraft trials would be held in Mass, which sounds like a triumph of reason, but really, it was more like a parent walking into a room full of smashed dishes and saying, "Okay, everyone stop breaking things." Still, the damage was done. The village's social fabric had more holes than Reverend Paris's sermons. Families of the executed were left destitute, land was seized, reputations evaporated. Some of the officials tried to make amends, holding public fasts and prayers. Samuel Sewell, one of the judges, stood before his congregation in January 1697 and publicly confessed his guilt, begging for God's mercy. He even fasted every year on the anniversary of the trials until his death. That's one way to never skip a meal of humble pie. Others, like Reverend Paris, weren't quite so penitential. He tried to salvage his career, spinning sermons about how Satan had tricked the judges and afflicted alike, which was convenient because it absolved him from both categories. The congregation was done with him. By 1697, Paris was politely shown the door, his legacy reduced to being that guy who brought witchcraft hysteria to town. Not the resume highlight he had hoped for, but beyond Salem's borders, the trials stirred bigger ripples. The colony as a whole realized that the witch panic had undermined the very religious ideals it claimed to defend. Puritan Massachusetts had built itself on the belief that it was God's chosen experiment, a shining city upon a hill. Instead, it had revealed itself as a city that burned its neighbors. For ministers like Increasmuth, the lesson was theological. Satan had used false visions to deceive the faithful, proving that even the holiest could fall for illusions. He wrote a lengthy apology of sorts, carefully balancing regret with his son, Cotton Mather, doubled down, publishing his own defenses and insisting that while innocence may have died, witchcraft itself still existed. For men who loved moral clarity, admitting full error was unthinkable. They blamed everyone and no one, which is basically the default human setting after a disaster. Still, their writings influenced how later generations saw the trials. The Mathers reframed the events as a spiritual cautionary tale rather than judicial mania. Over time, that framing soft collective memory, Salem became less about the victims and more about abstract warnings. Beware mass hysteria. Beware false prophets. Beware your imagination without a minister's supervision. Let's float now to the quieter personal aftershocks. The lives wrecked in slow motion. The afflicted girls, those trembling teenage prophets of doom, had to live with their own legacies. Ann Putnam Jr., who accused 48 people, gave a public apology in 1706. She claimed she had been deluded by the devil, not acting of her own will. Her community forgave her because by then, everyone wanted forgiveness to be fashionable again. Abigail Williams, Reverend Parris's niece, vanished from recorded history after the trials. No dramatic ending, just gone. Some say she died young. Others think she married far away under a new name. Either way, she slipped into the fog of history, which, frankly, might have been the kindest possible outcome. Betty Parris recovered from her fits, grew up, married, and lived an unremarkable life, as if quietly choosing never to mention any of it again. Taiteba, that first and most tragic link in the chain, disappeared too, sold to a new owner after months in jail. No one wrote down where she went or how she lived. The colony didn't care. History rarely does for the people it uses most cruelly. It's easy to talk about judges and ministers, but the witch trials left invisible scars on every rung of Salem's quiet hierarchy. Servants who lost their employers, families that refused to speak the accused's names, children forced to beg in neighboring towns because their parents were dead or imprisoned. One small episode after another, forgotten in that Puritan tendency to bury grief under piety. By 1700, the entire community was pretending to move on. They rebuilt the meeting house, restructured the parish boundaries, and changed town leadership. It was like sweeping ashes under fresh snow. They even renamed parts of the area. Salem Village eventually became Danvers, perhaps because the old name carried too much ghostly baggage. Yet, psychologically, Salem never escaped itself. Generations later, descendants still debated whether their ancestors had been righteous or deluded. The guilt became hereditary. The story became myth. Because when human beings don't know how to process collective guilt, they turn it into folklore, something you can tell around a fire, holding it at safe distance. Through irony, which brings us to how the world beyond New England remembered Salem. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, Americans rediscovered the witch trials every time they needed a moral parable. Ministers used it as sermon material. Early historians painted it as a grim but necessary path toward enlightenment, a lesson in rational progress. In other words, we had to lose our minds once to learn how not to. A tidy narrative, but not entirely honest. By the time Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote The Scarlet Letter, he was grappling with his own family's part in it. His ancestor, Judge John Hathorne, had gleefully interrogated the accused. Hawthorne spent his career haunted by that inherited guilt. He added a W to his surname partly to distance himself. Generational remorse. Brought to you by colonial overreach. Then came The Crucible. Centuries later, where Arthur Miller used Salem as a mirror for 1950s McCarthyism. He saw the same moral panic dressed in modern anxiety, just swap witch for communist. The play made the trials iconic again, transforming them from dusty history into timeless allegory. From then on, Salem stopped being a place. It became a warning label for human behavior, fragile truth under pressure. But let's have a closer again. This is still a bedtime story. After all, the strangest thing about the Salem Witch Trials is how ordinary the seeds were. Fear of outsiders, pressure to conform. Gossip, elevated to evidence. No one set out to become part of a tragedy. The villagers thought they were protecting their home. The judges thought they were saving souls. Everyone was doing their duty, which makes it worse, not better. Evil, in this story, is administrative, not supernatural. And that may be why the story keeps its grip, because everyone, in their own small way, understands Salem. It's the office rumor that ruins a career, the mob comment thread that spirals, the friend group that turns on itself for moral sport. Technology changes. Fear doesn't. Salem was simply the 17th century version of what humans always do when they can explain why they unhappy. They invent an enemy. So now, here in the dim light, picture Salem not as a nightmare, but a mirror. The snow falling slow over wooden roofs, the sound of wind brushing against the meaty house shutters. Everyone inside is exhausted. Judges with heavy villagers scrubbing the air clean with prayer. Girls who no longer know whether their nightmares were real. The fields outside are gray and empty. Somewhere, a grave marker leans crooked under ice. Its carving worn smooth, a name once cursed, now unreadable. Time, doing what justice could not. That is what really happened in Salem. Not witches, but people. Not magic, but mistakes. A small town, very human, very frightened. Forever remembered for having believed its own shadows. Welcome back, Night Owl. We've drifted through the winter woods of Salem's guilt and decay, through the whispering aftermath of a village trying to forget itself. Now, we float towards something a little stranger. The afterlife of the Salem Witch Trials, in culture, memory, and myth. Because, as it turns out, history doesn't stay buried. It just reinvents itself every few centuries with a new outfit and a souvenir shop. Let's begin in the quiet centuries after the panic. Salem lay low for a long time. By the early 1700s, it was just another colonial town trying to grow wheat, avoid scandal, and pretend it hadn't executed nearly 20 people based on bad visions. The trials became the kind of family story you only mention when you re-show everyone else's drunk, an embarrassing ancestral footnote tucked between harvest stats and church logs. But the memory didn't vanish. It sat there, dormant, like old embers beneath wet snow. Every so often, someone would poke at it, a historian, a minister, a moral philosopher, each trying to decide what Salem meant. Was it the devil's trick? Human failure? Divine punishment? Or just the 1600s being, well, the 1600s, by the mid-1800s? As America industrialized and rediscovered its colonial nostalgia, Salem resurfaced in literature. People were suddenly nostalgic for puritanical misery. Authors like Nathaniel Hawthorne and Harriet Beecher Stowe mined the witch trials for metaphors about shame, guilt, and hypocrisy. The witch hunt turned from theology into psychology. Not about demons out there, but the ones in here, always tapping at the moral window. Hawthorne especially carried it like a family curse. His ancestor, Judge John Hathorne, had shown no remorse for condemning the accused. It haunted Hawthorne so badly he rebranded his own name, adding an extra W like an exorcism. In his stories, The House of the Seven Gables, young Goodman Brown. Salem's gloom hangs in every fog-covered street and mossy shingle. His New England isn't noble. It's neurotic. Everyone's still trying to atone for something their grandparents did. Through Hawthorne, Salem grew into a symbol of American guilt. Not just about witchcraft, but the entire Puritan legacy, intolerance disguised as virtue. The witch trials became shorthand for what happens when righteousness goes blind. They provided literary shadow to all the country's bright talk about freedom and progress. Every ideal, it turns out, needs a ghost story attached to keep it humble. Fast forward to the 20th century, and the story mutates again. By the 1950s, Arthur Miller took Salem and rebranded it for the Cold War. The Crucible used the trials as a perfect mirror for McCarthyism, a time when Americans accused each other of communism with the same moral fervor their ancestors used for witchcraft. It was tidy, devastating symmetry. Instead of girls screaming about specters, there were senators waving lists of names. Same rhythm, new costumes. The play cemented Salem as cultural shorthand for mass hysteria. Politicians, journalists, even sports commentators started saying witch hunt whenever someone got unfairly targeted. The phrase stopped meaning cauldrons and started meaning scapegoats. The irony is that now everyone uses it, from protest groups to billionaires on social media, sometimes correctly, sometimes just to dodge responsibility. Even the language became haunted by Salem's ghosts. Meanwhile, the real town of Salem was learning to live with its legend. By the early 1900s, tourism had peaked its curious head. Visitors came looking for witchy ruins and left with pamphlets. Locals were divided. Some wanted to move on. Others figured, if you're stuck with an embarrassing past, you might as well monetize it. And so witchcraft, once a capital crime, became a marketing theme. By the 1970s, modern witchcraft movements, Wicca, pagan revivalists, spiritual feminists embraced Salem as symbolic ground. They built metaphysical shops, started festivals, and reframed witch not as evil, but as empowered. Slowly, the town's energy flipped. What was once accusation turned into identity. In a way, the witches finally came back. Just not how anyone expected. Every October, Salem now hosts thousands of visitors who come for candlelit tours, psychic readings, costume parades, and carefully somber memorials for the victims. The memorial stones, carved with the names of those executed, sit quietly near the old burying ground, a small patch of sincerity amidst the broomstick heap. The irony of it all would probably make Cotton Mather choke, but maybe that's fitting. The same story that once destroyed lives now sustains them, spiritually, economically, and emotionally. Salem has become a kind of cultural paradox, part cautionary tale, part carnival, a town performing its own redemption, night after night, beneath neon signs that say, "Welcome witches." Now, let's glide past the souvenirs and think about what witch means today. The word has shapeshifted once. It was fear in human form. Now, it's empowerment. Yet the undercurrent remains the same. It's always been about control. Who gets to define truth? Who gets to choose what's forbidden? Who gets to call someone dangerous? The trials may have ended, but every generation finds new ways to reenact them. It's not all heavy, though. Pop culture has made witches oddly comforting, from cartoon witches brewing sparkly mischief to self-care candle rituals sold in city boutiques. The witch is no longer an outcast. She's a lifestyle brand. Salem's tragedy morphed into aesthetic, mystic, feminine, moonlit. The misunderstood outsider turned soft power icon. History, with excellent rebranding. And somewhere in this transformation, the story found peace. The names of the victims, Bridget Bishop, Sarah Good, Rebecca Nurse, are spoken again. Not an accusation, but acknowledgement. The trials aren't warnings anymore. They're quiet memorials. People come not to gawk, but to remember. To say, "We see you. We're sorry we ever became that kind of species." At night, modern Salem feels almost cinematic. The air smells like old wood, sea salt, and candle wax. A busker plays violin in the square. Tourists wander past, witch museums, and locals talk about zoning permits and grocery sales. The ghosts, if they still wander, must be confused. No torches, no gallows, just curiosity and selfies. They would hardly recognize the place. But maybe that's the final redemption. The hysteria that began in fear transformed into a lesson, then into art, and finally into empathy. Salem found forgiveness, not through sermons, but through storytelling. By retelling the past, Aubert and Aubert, we made sure no one could ever claim it didn't happen. And in that endless retelling, something fragile survived a collective conscience. If you ever visit, The Witch Trials Memorial sits quietly off Charter Street. It's small, understated. Names carved in stone benches, surrounded by trees. Visitors leave flowers or coins, sometimes a note. And if you stand there long enough, the sea breeze carries a hush over the stones. You can almost hear the apology of centuries, faint, sincere, and finally calm. Tonight, as our story winds down, think of Salem not as a symbol of darkness, but as proof that people, however flawed, can learn, can change, can transform horror into meaning. The trials ended in tragedy, but the remembering turned into healing. Every retelling, every sigh, every flickering candle for a name etched in stone is a whisper that history doesn't own us unless we let it. This is the end of the Salem Witch Trials story, from paranoia to penance, from firelight to folklore. Now we drift back to the rough coastlines and smoky longhouses of medieval Scandinavia, the land of sails, sagas, and surprisingly pragmatic parenting. You can dim the lights, maybe pull a blanket up to your chin, because tonight's story is about Viking mothers. Yes, the people best known for raiding monasteries and hitting other people with axes also had to deal with diaper duty, childhood tantrums, and teaching their kids not to steal the neighbor's chickens. The Viking Age wasn't all sword-swinging and horned helmets, though for the record, they didn't actually wear horns. They preferred sensible iron caps, which might say a lot about their parenting style too. Practical, sturdy, and occasionally terrifying. You probably wouldn't argue with a Viking mom about bedtime, so let's settle in among the seaweed-scented breezes and the creak of wooden beams. A fire crackles. Somewhere outside, a dog barks. Inside the longhouse, a mother hums an Old Norse lullaby that probably involves both love and the threat of frostbite. Because that's how you kept kids motivated back then. When a Viking child came into the world, it was mostly the mother's domain. Forget doctors or hospitals. Birth took place at home, on packed earth floors covered with woven mats, in a corner curtained off for privacy. The midwife, or the closest thing to one, was usually an older female relative or neighbor who'd seen a few things, meaning she'd delivered half the village and still had opinions about your nutrition. Giving birth was dangerous. Vikings accepted that bluntly, as they did most unpleasant realities. Women often gave birth alone, with only minimal help. Survival rates weren't high, which probably explains why Norse mythology is full of stoic goddesses who just keep going, despite everything. Childbirth, in that world, was another battle, and many women were treated as warriors for surviving it. If a baby lived, the next big event was the acceptance ceremony, usually 9 days after birth. Until then, the child wasn't officially part of the family or community. It's a bit harsh by modern standards, but given infant mortality rates, people hesitated to get too attached until the odds looked slightly less grim. At the naming ceremony, the father would lift the baby up, symbolically accepting them into the household. The family sprinkled water over the child's head, a ritual that looked suspiciously like baptism. Though this was before Christianity's full takeover of Scandinavia, the parents often named children after deceased relatives, hoping to pass along some of their strength or reputation. You could say it was their version of family recycling. From then on, Viking babies were everyone's problem, in the best way. Longhouses housed extended families, plus servants plus animals, that occasionally wandered inside because doors were optional. In that noisy, smoky space, mothers weren't alone in childcare. Grandmothers, aunts, and older siblings all pitched in. The line between yours and ours blurred. Children learned early to fit into the rhythm of work. There was no special childhood in our modern sense. No school buses or structured play dates. Play existed, but it was disguised as training. Miniature swords, tiny boats, small wooden tools. Kids learned their future roles through imitation. A little boy might toss sticks, pretending they were spears. A little girl might practice weaving beside her mother, turning wool into something actually useful. But make no mistake, Viking mothers held real authority. While their husbands sailed off to raid or trade, women ran the household, managed food stores, oversaw servants, and settled disputes. The Norse word husfru, lady of the house, was an honoret. She had literal keys hanging from her belt, symbolizing her control over the home's provisions. If the keys jingled as she walked, that was basically the sound of power. Her word ran the household economy, and her glare could probably still silence a warrior. Education for Viking children wasn't about books or classrooms. Most couldn't read or write until Christianity brought monks and manuscripts later on. Knowledge came orally, through observation, repetition, and storytelling. Mothers taught by example. If you wanted to learn survival, you watched. If you wanted to learn moral values, you listened. The sagas tell us that Viking mothers were both nurturing and blunt. They didn't indulge unnecessary weakness. There's a famous bit of advice in the a collection of Old Norse wisdom. A man should never boast until the day he dies. That sort of stoic practicality seeped into parenting. Children were expected to endure small hardships with dignity. Cold, hunger, scraped knees, emotional trauma, you name it. It wasn't cruelty, it was training for the world they lived in. That said, Vikings were affectionate by contemporary standards. Archaeological evidence and saga references hint at parents genuinely enjoying their kids, giving them nicknames, singing lullabies, crafting simple toys like balls, dolls, and little carved animals. They weren't sentimental in a Hallmark way, but they found joy in small things. Love existed quietly among the rough edges woven into songs, in the food shared, in the way a mother tucked fur around a sleeping child during a snowstorm. Let's talk about discipline, which wasn't exactly gentle, but wasn't all whips and stern lectures either. Viking children were expected to respect elders, follow house rules, and not cause public embarrassment. The sagas often mention honor beginning in childhood, meaning you behaved properly because your family's reputation depended on it. But didn't mean absolute submission. Norse society admired independence. A bold, curious child wasn't punished for being outspoken as long as they knew their place. It was a delicate balance. Polite rebellion, the early training ground of warriors and survivors alike. Mothers managed that line daily, often without men around to help. And really, given Viking men's travel schedules, single parenting was more the rule than the exception. Some researchers suggest Viking women had a more flexible approach to child-rearing than some other medieval cultures. They had neither time nor reason for over-control. If your husband was away raiding in Ireland and you were milking goats, weaving cloth, and keeping the fire alive, you weren't counting how many berries. Little Eric ate raw from the bush. You just hoped he didn't choke or wander into the forge. The rest, as they'd say, was in the hands of the gods. Religion played a role too. Before Christianity, Viking mothers told stories of the gods. Odin the wise wanderer, Thor the noisy protector, and Freya goddess of love and war, who somehow balanced both without losing her temper. Myths were both lullabies and lectures. They taught courage, fairness, and humor at life's absurdities. Kids learned morality from stories that mixed awe and sarcasm, essentially early bedtime mythology podcasts. When Christianity arrived, it changed everything. Slowly, missionaries introduced churches, schools, and Latin alphabets. Children of higher status families might now get formal education, boys more than girls, of course, because gender equality had yet to receive divine approval. But even mothers still handled moral teaching. If a child learned their prayers properly, it was usually because a woman had made sure of it between weaving sessions. Let us drift now into the emotional heart of Viking motherhood. The duality of steel and tenderness. A Viking woman could read weather from the sky, birth a child, smoke fish, trade goods, and defend her home if raiders arrived. She had to be endlessly adaptable because the world around her demanded it. To survive the North, you needed flexibility disguised as strength. Some mothers carved wooden runes for protection over their children's cradles. Others attached small Thor's hammer pendants to necklaces, warding off harm. Superstition was part of love. They couldn't control disease or fate, but they could whisper charms, brew herbs, and trust that the gods preferred polite requests. And grief, though seldom spoken, was constant. Many mothers lost children young. Archaeologists find tiny graves near Viking farmsteads, often close to the main house. Families kept their dead close, not out of morbidity, but memory. Death wasn't an ending so much as an absence everyone learned to live beside. Each burial mound was both warning and comfort. Life is frail, but the stories endure. Through it all, the Viking household functioned like a living organism, everyone interdependent. Mothers carried practical wisdom like currency. They taught not just how to cook or mend, but how to face uncertainty without fear. Children learned by the rhythm of work, the cadence of old songs, the look their mother gave them when they dared misbehave during a feast. And as those children grew sons into traders, raiders, farmers, daughters into household keepers or travelers, they carried that early guidance into the wider world. Even warriors far from home wrote poems about longing for their mother's bread or the smell of the hearth fire back in Norway. You can bet that amidst all their stoic poetry, there was a soft ache for the woman who taught them not to cry, except when the mead ran out. So, as the fire fades and the North Sea winds hum through our imagination, we can see Viking motherhood for what it really was. Not romantic, not brutal, but resilient. It was practical love wrapped in wool and smoke, shaped by necessity but softened by human warmth. These women weren't queens or saints. They were everyday miracle workers, keeping civilization alive between raids and winters that lasted a little too long. Welcome, bike traveler of time and bedtime. You've made it past childbirth in a smoky longhouse and survived the early years of Viking domestic chaos. Now let's float quietly into the next chapter of Viking childhood, the years after the lullabies, when the small bundle in a fur blanket becomes a half-feral creature chasing goats and learning how to exist in a world that doesn't care much for second chances. Here, we're not talking about princes and castles or monks with ink-stained fingers. Viking children came from stone houses and icy shores. They were tough because the landscape gave them no other option. They were curious, creative, and totally prepared. Becoming a farmer, sailor, or raider takes work. It takes training, storytelling, scraped knees, and a few near-death experiences involving axes. To picture a child's day in a Viking settlement, think of a small, wriggly figure wrapped in wool, running across cold soil scattered with carved wood chips and flapping chickens. The morning starts early. Always. The longhouse wakes up with the sunrise or whatever light filters through the smoke hole. A mom might be busy grinding grain or milking cows, while the dad could be fixing tools or piecing together a ship. The children, they hover nearby, mimicking everything like apprentices in training. Play existed, but it was disguised as survival practice. The archaeological record gives us a gentle peek. Tiny toy boats carved from wood, little sleds, miniature swords. You can almost imagine the kids down by the fjord racing toy ships across Poodle, pretending to raid monasteries without realizing the adults would soon reenact those very games on a much bloodier scale. Viking society didn't think of childhood as a protected bubble. A kid was expected to work the moment they could stand steady and understand commands. At 5 or 6, boys gathered wood, herded sheep, helped mend fences. Girls helped with cooking and spinning flax, learned sewing, and tended younger siblings who were somehow always sticky with birch sap. Childhood wasn't treated as delicate. It was functional, like everything else in their world. Still, Viking children weren't joyless. Norse parents understood humor. The sagas talk about laughter at feasts, jokes during labor, songs sung while rowing. That humor filtered down to the kids, who must have invented endless small mischiefs to survive the monotony of chores. They had fun with bones, stones, and sticks, simple stuff, but super creative. In a world filled with legends of gods and giants, even an ordinary rock could become a dragon's egg if you squinted hard enough. Sometimes you'll find references to Natleiker, an ancient Norse ball game involving sticks and running halfway between hockey and organized chaos. It was popular even among adults, but children learned it early. Historians suspect it occasionally escalated into fights, which probably only made it more popular. Vikings didn't shy away from competitiveness. If someone walked away with a missing tooth, that just meant that training was effective. Now, about learning, the Viking classroom didn't have blackboards. It had mouths, stories, and repetition. Most teaching came orally, because writing hardly existed outside monasteries. The key curriculum: mythology, farming, seafaring, and good manners at feasts. Mothers and elders passed down stories of gods and ancestors. Through those tales, children absorbed moral lessons without the need for lectures. When your bedtime story is about Loki accidentally destroying the world, subtlety becomes optional. By hearing these sagas, children memorized immense stretches of oral poetry. Words had power in Norse culture. A good memory meant social respect. A forgetful child was mildly pitied like a broken piece of furniture. Still useful, but not ideal. And then there were songs, lullabies, work songs, chants to keep rhythm while rowing or grinding grain. They wrapped language into daily labor. Before literacy, songs were the archives. Mothers sang of storms and survival, embedding geography and morality in rhyme. A Viking child could probably identify half the world's gods before they could tie their shoes, if shoes were even a daily luxury, which was debatable. Discipline deserves a quiet glance, too. Viking parents weren't cruel for sport, but they were honest about consequences. If you broke something critical, a tool, a pot, a goose, punishment was immediate. That could mean extra chores, lost privileges, or, if you really tested fate, a sharp scolding or switch. They valued obedience, but also courage. A fearful child reflected badly on their upbringing. So, yes, they wanted polite manners, but mild defiance in the name of bravery was secretly admired. A contradiction wrapped in a fur cloak. Older mentors played a role, too. Boys might live for seasons with an uncle or family friend, learning specialized skills like navigation or combat. Peace practice, cold fostering, built social bonds beyond blood. It ensured children weren't just good at chores, they were networked into the community. In those foggy northern villages, knowing who owed you favors was almost as valuable as knowing how to gut a fish. Meanwhile, young girls were fostered in domestic crafts. They learned weaving, an art so essential it shaped the Norse economy. Textiles, especially sailcloth, were insanely valuable. Some historians call Viking women the hidden engine of expansion. Without their weaving, those sleek ships would never have left the fjords. So, when a mother taught her daughter to twist yarn, she wasn't just doing busy work. She was training the next generation of empire builders, one spindle at a time. As puberty arrived, and earlier than you'd expect, considering the diet of fish and hardship, life got serious. Marriage arrangements began early. A girl of 12 or 13 might be promised to a man twice her age, not out of cruelty, but survival instinct. Every alliance mattered. Mothers coached their daughters on household management and negotiation skills that would define their adult authority. Husbands might own land, but wives controlled the rhythm of everyday existence. Boys, meanwhile, shifted from farm help to apprenticeships in trade or combat. Some followed their dads on sea trips, while others learned from craftsmen like blacksmiths or shipbuilders. By 15, a Viking boy was no longer a kid. He might be sailing to the British Isles, armed with enthusiasm and at least one inherited sword he didn't fully know how to use. Religion colored all of this. Paganism in daily Viking life wasn't theatrical. It was woven quietly into chores and meals. Mothers sprinkled ale or milk as small offerings to household spirits called landvit. Kids picked up these rituals before they could even talk, copying their parents pouring milk by the fire. Faith, to them, wasn't about temples. It was about pattern and respect, the daily whisper that everything had spirit. The stories about gods weren't moral commandments. They were examples. Flawed, funny, terrifying examples. Thor wasn't holy. He was temperamental, brave, sometimes drunk. Odin was wise but manipulative. Even the gods gave bad advice, which must have been a comfort for imperfect parents. Through myth, Viking children learned humility. Even divine beings messed things up regularly. As Christian influence spread, the tone of childhood subtly changed. Monks set up small schools for boys, destined for clerical work. There, kids learned Latin prayers instead of sagas. Many Viking parents were suspicious. Education that didn't involve hammers sounded suspiciously elite. Still, Wealthier families eventually embraced literacy as a form of prestige. Knowing scripture became a sleek new form of power. Yet deep in the villages, the old oral world lingered for centuries, where mothers still told tales of giants instead of Genesis before the evening fire. Seasonal rhythms shaped the childhood calendar. Summer was everything. Long days, open fields, travel opportunities. Kids ran barefoot through the grass, helped with hay, picked berries, swam in chilly lakes, made daisy crowns, and wrestled for fun. Winter was the opposite, closing in, smoke indoors, endless nights illuminated by fire. Families clustered closer, telling stories, repairing tools, spinning tales thicker than the darkness outside. For Viking kids, winter probably felt like one long bedtime story, punctuated by chores. It was also when values were reinforced: bravery in isolation, patience under snow, gratitude for small comfort. Parents told myths of Ragnarok, the end of days, not to scare. But Teremian chaos will come, but so will continuity. It was philosophy disguised as entertainment. Despite the roughness, family affection was strong. Archaeologists have found carved trinkets, small gifts, and charms placed with children's remains, indicating love that survived loss. A famous burial site in Burka revealed a child buried with a toy horse. Another in Denmark had a bronze pendant shaped like a Thor's hammer. It's as if the parents wanted to send their children into eternity, still protected, still playing. And as grim as mortality was, the Vikings didn't romanticize it. Death was another voyage. The same sea that took their fathers might also take their infants. But life always moved forward. Every birth replaced a loss. Every story grafted old memory onto new youth. In a culture obsessed with legacy, children were the ultimate continuity, the living sagas in progress. By adolescence, the distinction between mother and teacher vanished entirely. Parenting shifted toward partnership. Boys who once watched their mothers grind grain now joined her at trading booths, helping barter fabrics or livestock. Girls who once watched weaving now managed production themselves. A Viking mother's greatest success wasn't her child's obedience, but their capability. If she could leave the farm for days, and the children kept it running, that was her version of pride. So when scholars describe Viking society as patriarchal, they're not wrong, but they're missing texture. Men ruled the public world. Law, warfare, exploration, but women and mothers formed its foundation. They were the educators, economists, emotional anchors, and occasional disciplinarians, with the grip strength of iron. They built the kind of humans who could cross the North Atlantic in open boats without panicking. Let's end this part in the longhouse again. Evening descending over the fjords. A child yawns, poking the embers while his mother hums softly, maybe a song about Thor's misadventures or Freya's tears turned to gold. Everything around smells like wool, fire, and salt. Outside, waves crash against the shore in a rhythm that feels ancient. The mother's voice fades, the child dozes, and the world for once is quiet. Tomorrow, he'll wake and chase dreams bigger than the horizon. But tonight, he sleeps wrapped in the legacy of Viking mothers. Strength tempered by tenderness, discipline meets storytelling, with love teaching resilience quietly. Hey again, late wanderer! The fire's still glowing, the longhouse still hums, and our small Viking child has now grown into something halfway between a workhorse and a legend in training. Tonight, we watch youth turn into adulthood, the slow, restless phase where a Norse boy starts dreaming of horizons, and a Norse girl begins wielding her authority calmly, silently, and with the efficiency of someone who can survive 6 months of snow without losing her mind. This is the part of Viking life most people forget of in-between years. We pictured them as warriors or settlers, but before that came awkward adolescence, endless chores, and lectures disguised as even in the land of sagas, growing up was complicated, sweaty, and occasionally awkward. By their early teens, Viking children were effectively adults in training. Life expectancy was short, so youth had to be efficient. The line between farmhand and heir blurred early. Every chore mattered. Every day was practice for independence. If you could plow, row, and so by 14, you weren't a child. you were a potential future. This was also the time of subtle rites of passage, small, unsupervised tests, rather than grand ceremonies. For boys, it might mean taking part in the first trading voyage, or venturing into the forest alone to hunt. For girls, it could mean overseeing household duties without mistakes, managing the drying racks and the stores, making sure not a single smoked fish spoiled. Mundane trials. Yes, but those were the measures that defined competence in a community that built everything by hand. Courage wasn't reckless bravado. It was reliability under cold skies. Viking parents valued steadiness far more than swagger. And still, somewhere under all that discipline, adolescence brought the same restless energy we all know. The sagas mention young men who boasted too much, got drunk too early, picked needless fights. There's something strangely comforting about that proof that have always believed they were invincible. Viking sons didn't always stay home. Many were sent away as fosterlings to other families, a social arrangement that built alliances and broadened horizons. Being fostered meant starting fresh, learning another household's customs, and earning reputation. Independent of birth, foster parents were expected to treat their wards as their own, though there was sometimes healthy competition between biological and foster fathers, about whose affection carried more weight. Through fostering, children forged bonds that later shaped politics, trade, and loyalty. A boy grown with a neighbor as son might later fight beside him or trade goods across seas. The friendships, deeper than casual kinship, acted as the glue of Norse society. The world beyond one's home became tangible, and curiosity replaced childhood boundaries. For mothers, fostering was bittersweet. Sending your child away in exchange for alliances took trust and restraint, but it was also proof that your teaching had worked. You'd raise someone fit to represent your family elsewhere, someone who could step into a strange longhouse and still remember to keep their elbows off the communal bowl. Girls faced their own version of expansion. As they matured, their power shifted inside rather than outward. A teenage girl in a Viking village might soon carry authority equal to a steward. She'd be responsible for produce, textile work, trade negotiations, all the matters that formed the real skeleton of community life. The sagas often portray confident women managing feasts, confronting neighbors, even advising their husbands on raids and deals. Marriage arrangements, though often practical, weren't as joyless as modern imagination paints them. Families matched personalities as much as properties, because an incapable partner could ruin both households. A Viking bride didn't go unarmed into marriage, either, sometimes literally. Archaeological graves show female burials, with household keys and knives hanging from their belts. The knife, ordinary in life, symbolic in death. It meant authority, readiness, and protection. Young men, meanwhile, leaned toward restlessness. The sea called like a half-remembered dream. Raiding and trading weren't that different two sides of ambition. The first overseas trips often came around 16 or 17, though some wealthy families waited until sons were older. These voyages weren't lawless free-for-alls. They were organized expeditions, balancing profit and risk. Mothers prepared them with the same stoic love that always shone quiet encouragement. Subtle warnings, sometimes a protective charm sewn invisibly into a tunic seam. The dangerous world beyond the fjord required belief, and a mother's blessing was its currency. Boys might roll their eyes, but in the thick of a storm, even the boldest raider remembered the words whispered at his departure. And if a son didn't return, grief stayed unspoken but heavy. Women who'd waited through 1,000 storms almost never wailed publicly. Mourning was private, steady, and unending, embedded into daily routine. The Norse memory system was storytelling itself, so mothers kept the dead alive through tales, reciting their names when lighting fires, repairing nets, humming over winter stews. Memory was love disguised as survival. Let's talk about mentorship. Viking youth learned from observation and mimicry, not lectures. A metalworker's apprentice copied gestures until instinct kicked in. A trader's helper memorized the weight of silver, the fairness of deals. For warriors, training was slower, calmer than movies make it seem. Strength wasn't about fanatical sword drills. It was coordination, patience, stamina. Viking fighting styles were practical, less theatrical. Fights were brief, brutal, and entirely functional, so long months of self-discipline prepared the youth more than wild sparring. Literary sources mention games and duels as social tests rather than violent brawls. Reputation was everything. Humiliation was worse than pain. Young men practiced verbal duels too, trading poetic insults known as flighting. It was sport mixed with philosophy, a way to test wit before weaponry. Losing gracefully mattered as much as winning. The mother's early lessons in composure paid off here. The emotional education of Viking youth remained anchored in family values. Obedience wasn't blind, it was balanced with loyalty and fairness. Parents weren't tyrants, they were fellow workers who expected endurance. The Havamal warned constantly against greed, arrogance, and cowardice. Teenagers learned morality through repetition of these verses. Half religious, half philosophical, the worldview was pragmatic. Do your work, honor your name, and remember every action echoes in eternity. Simple rules, but sturdy ones for a rough world. Interestingly, Viking society permitted affection between genders early, but demanded respect. Flirting existed as rune carvings, sometimes attacked. Teenagers carved love notes into rocks, but public indecency was frowned upon. Honor, reputation, and hospitality governed social life. Love stories in the sagas showed women choosing partners for independence as much as affection, which quietly challenged stereotypes about medieval submission. A Viking woman wasn't property. She was partnership embodied. Adulthood arrived earlier than expected. By 18 or 20, most were married, working their own farms, or sailing abroad. Independence wasn't optional. A delay in establishing yourself meant dependence, which risked shame. The most praised virtue was self-reliance, knowing how to run your life and household without complaint. And yet, even as new adults built their futures, maternal influence lingered. When explorers set out westward to Iceland, Greenland, or Vinland, women went to bringing household crafts that transformed empty settlements into homes. The Saga of Eirik. The Red even mentions Gudrid, a traveler who bore a child in North America, the first known European mother there. Proof that Viking motherhood literally reached the edge of the known world. As Europe shifted toward Christianity, Viking identity morphed. The home remained the moral nucleus. Mothers baptized infants instead of blessing them with water balls, but the nurturing rhythm was the same. The ideals of resilience, loyalty, and independence still echoed. Even when faiths changed, the ancient lessons persisted like driftwood, smoothed by time but impossible to break. By the later Viking centuries, literacy crept in. Some well-born daughters could read runes or Latin prayers. Boys destined for trade learned weights and numbers from foreign merchants. Education slowly formalized, just enough to bridge the gap between oral tradition and written record. Still, the heart of it all, how one behaved, treated others, and faced hardship, made the unspoken curriculum passed from one hearth to the next. Picture a summer evening near the end of this Viking youth's training years. The fjord glimmers copper under the setting sun. Boats are tied. Sheep bleat lazily. Smoke curls upward. Inside the longhouse, a mother watches her now-grown children laugh quietly. Repair gear, plan void. Her hair's braided with silver threads now. Her hands rough but steady. She doesn't preach, doesn't cling. She only watches, satisfied that her children know what to do when life turns difficult, which it always will. Outside, gulls cry over the tide. She stirs the pot, hums a tune she once sang to them as babies, and for the first time in years, finds herself at peace. That's the quiet turning point of Viking life. Childhood completing its spiral into independence. From birth to adulthood, everything followed one rhythm work. Care, story, repetition. The Viking mother began it. The grown child carried it forward into the world. The cycle went on, generation after generation, shaping not just a people, but a culture built on endurance, softened by affection. Hey there, traveler of the night. You've wandered all the way from Viking cradles to the threshold of adulthood, and the longhouse smells faintly of pine smoke and fish again. Children have grown up, ships have been built, and everyone's quietly planning to leave home, as Vikings always did. Tonight, Let's drift out to sea with them, not to raid or conquer, but to see what happened when Viking families carried their old ways into new lands, because parenthood didn't stop at the shoreline. The same mothers who once scolded their kids for tracking mud inside now watched them sail toward foreign coasts. Some followed. Some stayed. Either way, their lessons traveled, stitched invisibly into the sails that caught the North Sea wind. Once those grown children set sail, family values became cultural cargo, whether they reached Iceland, Greenland, or the British Isles. They carried their upbringing like a survival manual. The resilience learned from their mothers helped them adapt to everything unfamiliar. Rough terrain, strange languages, unpredictable neighbors. The Viking household structure, that balanced web of duty, love, and hierarchy, simply unfolded wherever they settled. Take the Icelandic settlers, for example. They created an entire society built on networks of kinship and memory. The sagas, recorded centuries later, are full of domestic echoes, mothers warning sons against feuds, women arranging marriages, and families debating honor at long feasts. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were oral history wrapped in moral instruction. Each narrative reminded the next generation who they were supposed to be: hard-working, cautious, clever, and fiercely loyal to kin. Even in Greenland, where survival scraped the edges of impossible, Norse settlers built farmsteads modeled after the old homeland. Life there depended on cooperation. Each family, isolated by ice and sea, leaned heavily on their own small community circle. That structure mirrored what mothers had always maintained in the Longhouse. Everyone working, everyone contributing, no one truly idle. The women who crossed oceans brought their authority with them. Records from Viking colonies show that marriages and property management followed similar patterns as back in Scandinavia. Husbands might be absent on trading voyages for years, but wives kept the home economy alive. They traded surplus, negotiated disputes, and occasionally organized local governance. Archaeologists in Iceland have even found legal documents marked by women managing estates. One example stands out. Aud the Deep-Minded, a wealthy widow who led her family from Scotland to Iceland after her husband's death in the late 9th century. She distributed land to her followers, founded settlements, and maintained her autonomy until her death. When said she was honored with a ship burial, one of the last of its kind. People remembered her as wise, generous, and entirely competent. In many ways, she was the peak evolution of the Viking matron. Pragmatic, commanding, yet grounded in kinship. Aud wasn't unique. She simply embodied the quiet power Viking motherhood had always cultivated. When haven't mothers, after all, been the ones holding chaos together, while pretending not to? Religion added complexity as Vikings settled among Christian lands. The gradual conversion across Scandinavia and the colonies didn't erase the old values. It blended them. Pagan rituals faded, but maternal authority endured. Christian missionaries praised obedience and chastity, but they quickly noticed Norse women still ran households with alarming confidence. The solution was compromise. Weave old habits into acceptable piety. So mothers now blessed bread in Christ's name instead of offering it to household spirits. Children were baptized, but the values stayed familiar. Courage, loyalty, fairness, endurance. Christianity just gave them fresher vocabulary. The Mikes produced something distinctive, a softened Viking ethos that shaped early medieval Europe, especially in regions under Norse influence like northern England, Ireland, and Normandy. In these places, the Viking domestic rhythm quietly merged with local customs. Families ran like small businesses. Children were raised to balance strength with diplomacy. The importance of storytelling, those long fireside lessons, persisted even as books and Bibles replaced oral sagas. If any Viking ghost ever wandered through a Christian abbey listening to a monk reading parables aloud by candlelight, it might have smiled, faintly at the familiar tone. A moral tale for restless youth. Now let's drift further west across the sea to Vinland. The mysterious Norse settlements, briefly established along North America's Atlantic coast. The archaeological site at Lanso Meadows hints that families lived there, even if only for a season or two. Imagine mothers weaving sails out of rough wool, while curious children watched the strange forests filled with unknown berries and unheard birds. History remembers only the explorers' names, but somewhere behind them were women maintaining meals, repairs, health, and harmony. Without them, no expedition lasted long. That's one of the quiet truths about migration. Behind every discovery was a domestic miracle. A Viking expedition without women fell apart quickly. They were the infrastructure of civilization in boots. The Vikings knew that instinctively. The sagas even describe men mourning not their own deaths, but the thought of their wives left managing fields alone. Survival, it turns out, was always a group project. As the centuries rolled forward, the Viking world faded into the medieval mainstream. The longhouses shrank into timber cottages. Axes gave way to plows, and the sagas transformed into literature instead of life. Yet the parenting model they'd built, practical, communal, and story-driven, stayed quietly alive in Northern Europe. You can trace it in the way Scandinavian families later emphasized independence in children, the custom of letting kids explore, make small mistakes, and learn from nature. Didn't start with modern outdoor education. It's a distant echo from Viking farms where children learned self-reliance by necessity. The same can be said of equality in household duties. A modern parent in rural Norway teaching sons and daughters to share chores is unknowingly borrowing from traditions that go back over 1,000 years. Even the famous Scandinavian stoicism, that calm endurance under pressure, has Viking roots. It's the same emotional restraint the mothers taught. Don't complain. Fix what's broken. And when life bites, bite back politely. Of course, the myths persisted. Later generations romanticized Vikings as barbaric conquerors or noble explorers. What got lost in that drama was the subtle humanity inside their homes. For every raid on a monastery, there were hundreds of evenings spent teaching a child to spin wool, to carve wood, or to count the stars for navigation. The sagas only remembered the battles, but the culture survived because of the kitchens, not the weapons. That balance between ferocity and care became a Nordic trademark. Outsiders wrote about the harshness of the land and the toughness of its people, but rarely saw the warmth underneath the shared meals, the songs hummed while working, the quiet fairness that governed even small disputes. Those habits didn't come from war. They came from the homes Viking mothers built. You could say they conquered the world's stories, not just by traveling, but by parenting. Every settler's descendant across Iceland, Scotland, and Ireland carried bits of the same foundation: cooperation, storytelling, stubborn optimism. Empires crumble, parenting styles somehow endure. By the late medieval period, the Norse legacy had dissolved into European normalcy. Their descendants farmed, prayed, and traded under Christian kings, and no one called themselves Viking anymore. Yet the cultural DNA lingered. Women in Scandinavia still held notable inheritance rights centuries after neighboring regions stripped those freedoms away. Female independence, never fully extinguished, kept flickering through laws, sagas, and folktales in Toyotomi. Centuries, someone reading a saga aloud by lamplight might pause at a familiar line about a wise mother or brave daughter, and realize the story sounded oddly modern. The Viking world, though gone, had left its fingerprints on daily life. Childhood had evolved to, instead of oral sagas, children now learned from priests or schoolmasters. Instead of axes, they handled quills. But when they faltered, their mother's advice still followed the same pattern. Stay calm, act fair, keep working, and don't think you deserve applause for doing the right thing. It wasn't cruel stoicism, it was quiet pride, carved over generations. Let's end our drift in a softer tone. Picture a Scandinavian coast long after the Viking Age, maybe around the year 1300. The ships are smaller now. The gods have changed, but a woman still hums over a cradle. The baby's wrapped in linen instead of fur. The walls are of stone instead of timber. But the rhythm is familiar. She sings of courage, patience, and home. Her ancestors once sang the same themes beneath different stars. Through every migration, conversion, and cultural shift, Viking motherhood's heart kept beating. Tough love wrapped in competence. practicality softened by story, and emotion hidden inside humor. It was the art of survival, disguised as ordinary care. So when you hear about Vikings crossing oceans or forging kingdoms, remember the ships were launched by sons and daughters, raised on lullabies, chores, and stories by the fire. Whatever glory they found out there began quietly, in the hands of women who kept the world turning while pretending they were just keeping the stew from burning. Now we're heading to Japan. The year is 1615. The air smells faintly of burnt cedar and wet armor, and the great Osaka castle, pride of the old regime, stands, hunched against the smoke of a dying dynasty. You can dim the lights, slip under your blanket, and let the samurai ghosts do the heavy lifting. Because tonight's story is about ambition, exhaustion, and one very uncomfortable sense of déjà vu. The moment Japan's last great rebellion folded into silence. Imagine it. A country that has been fighting itself for centuries suddenly trying to pretend it is at peace. The swords are sheathed. Mostly. The banner is lowered. Mostly. But no one is actually relaxed. The men who've survived decades of war now have to handle things like paperwork and taxes, which is probably more stressful. And in the middle of this awkward peace stands one massive symbol of the past Toyotomi clan, still clinging to relevance from the walls of Osaka. Let's float backward for a minute, because, as always, the end of something this dramatic starts long before the final act. 50 years earlier, Japan was in complete chaos. Warlords daimyos fought each other non-stop. Carving the country into territories so complicated you needed a map, 3 languages, and a headache pill to keep track. That era, the Sengoku period, was a blender of alliances, betrayals, and dramatic haircut decisions. Then came Oda Nobunaga, the man who pressed the start button on national unification. He modernized warfare, terrified everyone, and established that you could conquer half of Japan if you were ambitious enough and mildly unhinged. When he died, because someone always ruins the plan by burning a temple down, his brilliant general Toyotomi Hideyoshi stepped in to finish the job. And Hideyoshi did what no one had managed before he united the fractured clans under one rule, building a centralized government that actually worked. He also built Osaka Castle, absurdly large, glittering fortress meant to announce, "I run this place now." It had stone walls taller than a poet's expectations, gold decorations visible from miles away, and moats deep enough to convince everyone that if they ever got stuck there, they'd just stay forever. Osaka was less a castle and more an architectural ego trip. Hideyoshi lived there like a miniature sun god, managing the realm and dreaming up ridiculous schemes, such as invading Korea, just to see what would happen. Spoiler alert, it didn't end great. But history doesn't love stable emperors, it loves personality conflicts. So when Hideyoshi died in 1598, he left behind a toddler heir named Hideyoshi. This child, adorable, symbolic, and about as prepared for leadership as a loaf of bread, became the center of a very polite power struggle. Because someone needed to protect him, Hideyoshi had appointed a council of 5 elder senior daimyos, sworn to keep peace until Hideyori came of age. And you can imagine how well that went. Among them was one man quietly waiting to make his move. Tokugawa Ieyasu was everything Hideyoshi wasn't. Patient, meticulous, allergic to If Hideyoshi was the ambitious meteor, Ieyasu was the tectonic plate, the slow mover that eventually shifts continents. While others squabbled, Ieyasu built alliances, rearranged chess pieces, and by 1600 found himself at the center of one final, world-changing battle. That battle, the Battle of Sekigahara's, where it all tilted. It decided who would run Japan for the next 2.5 centuries. Ieyasu won, obviously. He always did. And in that single victory, the Toyotomi clan's bright empire turned into a sunset. So, by the time you and I arrive at the year 1614, the beginning of the Osaka campaigns, the stage is clear. Ieyasu, now the unchallenged shogun, runs the country from Edo modern Tokyo. He's old, calculating, and oddly fixated on eliminating potential problems. And there's only one left, the Toyotomi child. Now grown into a quiet young man surrounded by relatives who absolutely refuse to accept that their glory days are over. Hideyori still lives in Osaka Castle with his fiery mother, Yotojimi Elso, known as Lady Yoda. She's the kind of woman history books describe as strong-willed, which is code for way too confident for the men around her. She's convinced her son deserves to rule Japan, even though nearly everyone else disagrees. It's worth noting that, by this point, Ieyasu isn't technically shogun anymore. He's retired. Officially. Which, in his mind, means still in control, but with better excuses. His son, Hitada, holds the title now, but Ieyasu is the real architect behind every major decision. Retirement. Japanese still. Relations between Osaka and Edo are brittle. At first, they pretend to be civil. Hidari sends letters of loyalty to the shogun. The Tokugawa court responds with polite paranoia. Tensions escalate when Hidori begins repairing Osaka Castle's defenses. Ostensibly, he is just bracing for any minor rebellion or misfortune, a completely reasonable act in a country with decades of muscle memory for chaos. But to Tokugawa eyes, it looks like rebellion. And who can blame them for paranoia? The castle is still massive. The Toyotomi name still whispers through the province. And even minor daimyos, irritated with Tokugawa, rule keep glancing at Osaka, like it's a beacon of second chances. Ieyasu, naturally, prepares for war under the excuse of maintaining peace, a spectacular bit of historical irony. As winter 1614 arrives, war finally sneezes into existence. The Tokugawa army marches toward Osaka, bringing somewhere around 200,000 men. For perspective, that's practically the size of a small city carrying spears. On paper, the Toyotomi defenders don't stand a chance, but Osaka Castle is a monster. It's one of the strongest fortresses ever constructed in Japan. Its stone walls rise like cliffs. Its moats are broad enough to drown a cavalry regiment before they even get tired. Inside the castle, the defenders rally. You can picture it. Banners flickering in winter wind, women and servants carrying water buckets, children peeking from doorways as old retainers polish spears. Hideori, quiet and uncertain, relies heavily on his commander's men, like Sanada Yukimura, a brilliant strategist who, because history loves symmetry, had once fought against Tokugawa. At Yukimura's return gives the Toyotomi forces a pulse of energy. Legends will later call him the Crimson Demon. But for now, he's just tired, loyal, and too intelligent to have much hope. Still, hope is a job in civil wars. You keep showing up for it, even when the pay is bad. The siege begins. Tokugawa forces surround Osaka and begin shelling the outer defenses with cannon fire. Newly imported European-style siege weapons. Not that these make much difference. The castle barely flinches. The defenders answer with counterfire, surprising the attackers with their own artillery. It becomes a strange winter stalemate. Men firing cannons through snowflakes. Both sides wondering who's colder, not who's winning. Tokugawa engineers eventually breach sections of the moat. Inching closer. Days stretch into weeks. The city outside the castle becomes ghostly quiet. Inside, rumors swirl. Some say this shogun's army plans total annihilation. Others insist negotiations might save them. The truth hovers between slow diplomacy wrapped around mutual distrust. When peace terms are finally offered, they come with a familiar Tokugawa twist. Ieyasu pretends to show mercy. Osaka may keep its honor if the Toyotomi family demolishes its outer defenses. The desperate defenders agree. Huge sections of the moat are filled in. The ramparts leveled, the castle surgically peace, they believe, has arrived. That's the winter campaign of 1614. Indecisive, tense, but bloodless on the surface. For a brief month, everyone exhales. Osaka Castle glows again under winter sunlight. Villagers return to trading, and people dare to think the violence has paused. Which, of course, for Ieyasu, merely means stage one is complete. You can almost imagine the old man smiling somewhere in Edo, maybe near a campfire, wrapped in armor, pretending, as above scheming. He knows that removing Osaka's defenses wasn't a peace treaty. It was just the slow tightening of rope around an old rival's throat. All he has to do now is wait for a convenient excuse to finish the job. And naturally, an excusatory base. Because human beings can't leave well enough alone. Inside Osaka, resentment festers. The Toyotomi loyalists realize they've been tricked, their moat gone, their walls open. Some hot-headed warriors start digging and repairing sections by night. Word reaches Tokugawa, spies, who gleefully inform Ito that Osaka is rearming. Perfect. By spring 1615, Ieyasu's patience, the world's most dangerous resources, officially depleted. He calls up another massive army, determined this time to erase the Toyotomi clan entirely. No more letters, no more symbolic truces. The castle will fall, and the last embers of the old age will go with it. So, as cherry blossoms bloom across Japan, the armies march again, the banners rise, and the season of peace dissolves under bootprints. The siege of Osaka will have its encore final summer act, bathed in smoke and regret. Let's pause here for a breath. The moon glows softly over Osaka Bay. The castle stands magnificent but doomed, half its moats silent, half its defenders praying the sky itself will pick a side. In Ito, men write polite letters, claiming divine purpose. In Osaka, women hide their children in cellars, and somewhere between the two, you can almost hear the sigh of the nation, realizing that even after unification, it's not done learning about loss. The winter campaign has ended, technically in peace, but the calm feels heavy, unearned, like the stillness between thunderclaps. Nothing's over yet. Far from Italiano. The old Tokugawa patriarch sits back, sharpening his sense of timing. He has beaten every major rival he ever had, but he knows one truth. Power isn't real, until everyone who remembers another version of the world is gone. And in the echoing halls of Osaka Castle, where toy drums and borrowed courage still ring through the night, memory refuses to die. Hey again. Settle in. The winter snow around Osaka Castle has melted away, leaving muddy ground cracked like old lacquer. The peace, that fragile illusion crafted by letters and empty smiles, dissolves under spring sunlight. It's 1615 now, and the sound of war drums is echoing across the plain once again. The cherry blossoms are just starting to fall, which feels deliciously ironic that something this violent begins under petals that symbolize him. The truce from last year didn't even survive a season. The Toyotomi clan, tricked into dismantling the defenses during winter, realized too late that peace terms negotiated with Tokugawa Ieyasu came with invisible small print. Their moat had been filled in, their walls partially destroyed. They were defenseless, and everyone knew it. When word reached Ito that some of Hideyori's soldiers had dared to redig part of the moat at night, Tokugawa got exactly what he wanted. Justification? Rebellion, they called it. A revolt against divine order. It's the political equivalent of saying, "He breathed too loudly, so I had to invade." That spring, Ieyasu called his banners again. The old man was 73 by 10, but retirement still meant directing wars like a master conductor waving an invisible baton. Around 200,000 men joined his campaign, not all of them thrilled about another siege, but all of them too loyal or terrified to refuse. The armies assembled, like storm clouds rolling in from across the provinces, and once again, the people of Osaka looked out from their broken walls and prepared to die properly. Inside the castle, Hideyori and his mother, Yodojime, did their best to project calm leadership. She was the sharper one, living proof that maternal ambition can terrify entire governments. Her letters at this time show calculation, not naivety. She knew Tokugawa intended destruction. She urged her son to stand tall. You can almost picture her inside that echoing hall, silks rustling lightly against the floors, her face lit by a brazier, her voice low but steady as she addressed the last sons of warriors who deserved Hideyoshi decades earlier. To her, this wasn't really about politics anymore. It was about legacy, the stubborn refusal to vanish quietly. Hideyori, quiet by nature, didn't have his father's charisma or his mother's heat. But like a good character in a doomed epic, he stayed. He didn't flee, didn't surrender. He stood his ground in Osaka Castle, that great symbol built by the man who once united Japan. For all his uncertainty, that choice alone rescued him from history's complete dismissal. As the Tokugawa forces advanced, the defenders tried to recruit anyone still bitter about peace. Notices spread through the countryside, promising purpose and redemption. Some signed on, out of loyalty, to the Toyotomi name. Others came because there's always a handful of men who prefer battle to boredom. Still, even with these reinforcements, the Osaka side barely reached 1/10 of the enemy's numbers. Yet they weren't hopeless. Among them stood veterans who had fought at Sekigahara 15 years earlier, including Sanada Yukimura, who'd somehow become an almost mythic figure in Japanese folklore. People said his tactical sense could outthink 3 generals, and that to meet him on the field was to meet death politely. Every rebellion needs at least one living legend, and Yukimura was theirs gray-haired now. Slightly weary, but still brilliant. In May, the armies finally clashed at Tomi. The battlefield lay misty, the kind of half-awake dawn where the air feels too soft for violence. Tokugawa's vanguard moved fast, trying to cut off Osaka's outer defenses before reinforcements could arrive. Yukimura led a smaller contingent, perhaps, only a few thousand through thick fog and confusion. The result was chaos masquerading as strategy. Messages misread, signals unseen. Some units retreated before they'd even fought. It might have been tragic if it weren't so human century's haven. Tea changed the fact that large-scale communication mostly consists of inspired guesswork. Yukimura fought fiercely, buying time for forces elsewhere to regroup. When the mist lifted, the Toyotomi side had held but lost ground. Every victory now was temporary, the kind you carve from dust before it slips through your fingers. Meanwhile, in Edo and Kyoto, the political playwriting continued. The Tokugawa painted themselves as reluctant heroes responding to dangerous rebels. Official proclamations talked about purging corruption and restoring harmony. Into modern terms basically meant destroy the old regime before someone writes them a nice song. The irony was thick. The same empire Hideyoshi had unified was now turned against his ghost. By midsummer, the full assault began. The Tokugawa army encircled Osaka entirely, turning the surrounding plain into a sprawl of tents, banners, and logistics nightmares. Fresh water became scarce. Supplies were carried by the hour. The heat grew overwhelming, and men started dying before they even reached the battlefield. Not from arrows, but from heat stroke and exhaustion. Inside the walls, life shrank to bread rations, stale water, the dull rhythm of siege life. Children hid in cellar corners. The sound of cannon fire became background noise. Like distant thunder you eventually stopped noticing. Fire arrows whistled from the dark, and through it all, Sanda Yukimura and a few hundred loyalists kept fighting from the outer redoubts, holding off wave after wave. Then came the Battle of Tennogi. It would be the last, and both sides seemed to recognize it even before the first drum sounded. The Toyotomi troops marched out of Osaka Castle and met the enemy on open ground abroad. Nearly suicidal choice. Perhaps they wanted one final taste of genuine battle instead of slow death behind walls. It was May 6th, 1615. The fields shimmered in early summer heat. The ground was muddy from recent rains. Across the distance, Tokugawa banners stretched in neat, endless rows. The clash began like thunder, tearing the air in half. At first, somehow, the Toyotomi side gained ground. Sanada Yukimura led a charge so sudden, so concentrated, that several Tokugawa units faltered. For a moment, in that strange shimmer of noise and heat, it looked like the impossible might happen, that Osaka's shrinking rebellion might actually bite the hand that held the entire country. But a spark of hope is often the cruelest instrument. Reinforcements arrived. Lines cracked. Panic rippled. What began as defiance turned into retreat. Yukimura was wounded and captured during the fight. He refused to flee, famously telling his captors he was too tired to continue. When asked his name, he supposedly smiled and said quietly, "I am Sanada Please, take my head." They did. History is full of polite exits. Inside Osaka Castle, Hideyori and his mother received the news. Realizing the city was lost, they barricaded themselves in the inner compound. Tokugawa forces surrounded the last surviving gate. Fires began everywhere. Set intentionally and otherwise, the castle that had once caught sunlight on its golden rooftops was now lit from below by its own destruction. Accounts Bari, as they always do when history turns dark. Some say Hidori attempted suicide by sword. Others say he died in the burning keep alongside his mother, who refused to leave him. Either way, the explosion that consumed the main tower ended the Toyotomi line, vaporizing an entire generation's ambition in a few long minutes of fire and smoke. Outside the walls, Tokugawa troops looted what remained with a mechanical exhaustion. Ieyasu himself reportedly stood watching from a nearby temple, expression unreadable. He'd done exactly what he intended. Ended the last potential rebellion, unified Japan for good, and stamped out a dynasty whose shadow stretched longer than his patience. In the aftermath, the contrast was brutal. On one side, come victory parades in Edo. On the other, ashes swirling over Osaka Bay. The shogunate framed it as salvation. The Toyotomi had threatened peace, they said, and peace had been restored by righteous force. For peasants and traders far from the fight, it probably felt convenient enough. A country that had known chaos for 2 centuries finally exhaled and accepted calm, no matter the cost. Ieyasu didn't live long after that. Within a year, he was gone, another old man buried under the weight of decisions that somehow kept working. His son Hitada inherited the Tokugawa legacy, and the dynasty would rule Japan for more than 250 quiet, rigid years. The country closed in on itself, building walls not from stone, but from policies and fear of foreign influence. But that's a story for another night. Forgiveness, though, never really came to Osaka. The castle was rebuilt under Tokugawa command a few decades later, but as a monument to their own victory, not the memory it had been built for. The Toyotomi name faded into a whisper among merchants and storytellers. Only Yukimura remained, a folk hero transformed by song into the perfect doomed warrior, the man who fought knowing he'd lose because someone had to make the losing beautiful. Standing in Osaka today, you can visit a reconstruction of the castle, clean, symmetrical, bright white, above manicured parkland. It looks nothing like the burning labyrinth of 1615. But if you stand still long enough, especially near dusk when the city noise fades, you can imagine it. The echo of boots on wet stone. A mother's voice calling her son's name through smoke. Cherry petals drifting through charred air. The fire, and then silence. Japanese history doesn't do endings loudly. It prefers the serene acceptance of loss, the slow fade into stillness. And that's exactly how the siege of Osaka ended, quietly, inevitably, like the last exhale of an era, too proud to be forgotten, too heavy to be repeated. Hey again! The fires of Osaka have dimmed. The last sparks have folded into ash. And now, Japan stands strangely still, silent, exhausted, and ready to bury its swords under layers of etiquette and ink. After everything, after centuries of warlords, betrayals, and alliances written in blood, Tokugawa Ieyasu has finally gotten what he wanted. Absolute peace. But peace, as history often reminds us, isn't quiet because everyone's happy. It's quiet because everyone's afraid to speak too loudly. Tonight, we'll drift into the aftershocks, the long Tokugawa peace, or as textbooks prefer to call it, the Edo period. It lasted 2.5 centuries. That's 250 years of unbroken tranquility. At least on paper, beneath the surface, though the silence has texture. You can still feel the hum of repressed ambition under the porcelain politeness. Let's start with Tokugawa Ieyasu himself. He didn't get to enjoy the peace for long. Less than a year after Osaka's final siege in 1615, the old fox was gone, 74 years old, shriveled by age but smugly certain he'd won. His body was buried at Niku, beneath a forest of cedar trees, in a shrine that still glows with gold and lacquer. It's hard to say if he believed in immortality, but he certainly arranged his own brand of it. Ieyasu's death didn't interrupt anything. Power transitioned smoothly to his son, Hitada, who had all his father's control instincts and none of his patience. The Tokugawa family line had secured the title of shogun, a word that once meant general for the suppression of barbarians, but now mostly meant guy in charge of everything. The emperor, technically, still existed, sitting quietly in Kyoto, surrounded by poets and courtiers pretending money wasn't a problem. But politically, the emperor was a decorative vase, The real rule flowed from Edo, a modest fishing village turned capital city, and this city, with time, would become modern Tokyo. The Tokugawa regime learned from the chaos that came before. They didn't ban ambition. They smothered it with routine. They set up a system called Bakuin, a power-sharing structure between the central shogun government and the regional daimyo lords. Each domain could rule itself, but everything ultimately pointed back to Edo. Like spokes to a wheel, to keep feudal lords from getting any bright ideas, the Tokugawa introduced the Sankin-katai system, the alternate attendance policy. Basically, every powerful daimyo had to live in Edo every other year, bringing their families along. The reasoning was pure genius. On the surface, it looked like honor. Underneath, it was hostage-taking, disguised as etiquette. You could keep your province, but your wife and children stayed conveniently close to the shogunate, just in case. Terresul, a half-military, half-bureaucratic Japan, where everyone was dutiful, exhausted, and impeccably polite. The samurai class, those infamous warriors of Japanese legend, suddenly had no wars left to fight, and that created a cultural identity crisis large enough to fuel an entire philosophy. Picture it. Generations raised on discipline, trained to die gloriously in battle. And now their grandest battle is balancing budgets or writing poetry. A samurai without war is like a sword without an edge. Elegant, expensive, and vaguely useless. They didn't disappear, though. They reinvented themselves as administrators, teachers, thinkers. They traded blood for brushstrokes. Many turned to Neo-Confucianism, a philosophy stressing order, loyalty, and respect, which conveniently doubled as excellent propaganda for the shogunate. Samurai now valued virtue over violence. Dueling gave way to calligraphy. Armor rested, while scrolls multiplied. If you wandered the quiet streets of Edo in the 1600s, you'd find samurai reading Chinese classics, debating ethics, or mediating disputes between merchants. It's like watching lions teach accounting. The cat didn't lose its claws. It just learned to sign forms. For ordinary people, life stabilized in ways unimaginable under the Toyotomi or Oda Pharma. Farmers farmed, merchants grew rich, artisans developed entire neighborhoods dedicated to one craft paper in one district, knives in another. Urban life blossomed. Towns grew around castles and became cities, complete with theaters, tea houses, and a new form of celebrity. The kabuki actor. The irony of this peaceful age was that culture thrived precisely because it was so repressed. You couldn't climb socially, so you turned inward. Beauty became rebellion by stealth. The Edo period gave rise to ukiyo, the floating world, marked by art, music, pleasure, and melancholy. Painters made woodblock prints of courtesans, festivals, and moonlit rivers. Writers described fleeting joy in a world that pretended permanence. If death had dominated the Sengoku age, impermanence now ruled this one. The samurai composed poems about the fragility of blossoms. Merchants commissioned screens painted with morning mist. Everyone learned to find grace in boredom. That was survival. Yet, beneath the elegance, unease lingered. The Tokugawa shogunate had founded peace on surveillance. Neighbors watched neighbors. Schools preached obedience. Katanas stayed hung on walls, not just out of respect, but out of fear. Most people accepted this system. Life was predictable, safe, and comfortable. But human beings don't actually do well with eternal calm. Small acts of rebellion took subtler forms. Scholars began studying ancient learning, trying to rediscover Japan's pre-Chinese identity. Artists painted fantastical scenes, pretending they weren't metaphors for confinement. Even kabuki, the great popular theater, grew into an emotional outlet for everything no one could say directly. And somewhere, in the collective memory, stories of Osaka still glowed quietly. The siege became a cautionary tale. Bravery misplaced, loyalty punished, but also a whispered memory of freedom. Tokugawa power didn't rest solely on politics. It leaned on social engineering. And nowhere was this clearer than the rigid class system. Society officially divided into 4 groups: samurai, farmers, artisans, and merchants, each forbidden to cross categories. Samurai were supposed to lead by example. Farmers were to feed everyone. Artisans to build. And merchants, well, merchants were technically the lowest, though somehow always ended up the richest. The hypocrisy wasn't lost on anyone. Samurai sneered at wealth, but borrowed from merchants constantly. Wealthy townspeople decorated their homes with subtle arrogance, using plain exteriors to hide interiors filled with gold screens and imported china. It was the art of pretending modesty while quietly thriving. The government tolerated this so long as everyone kept pretending loyalty came before money. Peace, in the Tokugawa world, meant everyone playing their assigned part convincingly. Time slowed. Generations passed. The memory of the Toyotomi era became mythology. Children heard of Hideyoshi as a fable. The peasant who rose to power. The man who built Osaka Castle. The real blood. The burning towers. The swords. All melted into heroic nostalgia. Tokugawa shoguns came and went. 15 in total, over 265 years. Few were remarkable. Most were caretakers of a machine too stable to fail. Cities expanded. Commerce flourished. And isolation from the outside world deepened. In 1635, Japan sealed its borders almost completely under the Sakoku policy. Christianity was banned. Foreign travel prohibited. Contact limited to a small Dutch trading post in Nagasaki. The idea was simple. Peace could last only if no one brought foreign chaos inside. And, for a while, it worked. Japan became an island of stasis, while Europe exploded into revolutions, colonies, and industrial revolutions. The Tokugawa world stayed still, serene, ritualized, suspended like an insect in amber. But stillness is never eternal. By the 18th century, cracks began to show. Population pressures strained resources. Famine visited occasionally. Samurai found themselves poorer, each generation, living on decaying stipends. Merchants, meanwhile, got richer and subtler, running the economy beneath a veil of ritual humility. By the 19th century, Tokugawa control started sounding like a beautiful echo, clear but distant. When foreign ships finally appeared on the horizon, black holes slicing into Edo Bay under Commodore Perry in 1853, Japan woke up from an extraordinarily long nap. The shogunate, after all its success in keeping foreign influence out, collapsed less than 20 years later. But that's far beyond Osaka's twilight. The siege of 1615 had planted the seed for 2.5 centuries of balance between fear and flourishing. The Toyotomi died by fire, but their memory birthed a nation that learned to fear change so deeply, it built peace into ritual. At the heart of this long calm sat a delicate truth. The cost of unity was silence. It is the paradox Japan has wrestled with ever since, how to build harmony without suffocating the human desire to move, to question, to grow. And so, in the soft glow of Edo lanterns and the rustle of silk sleeves, Japan forgot war for generations. It remembered instead how to polish the surface of contentment, until reflection replaced motion. Samurai inked haiku instead of death oaths. Courtiers debated aesthetics instead of bloodlines. History, for once, dozed peacefully. If you visited Edo at midnight in 1700, you'd see lamps floating gently along riverbanks. Hear laughter echoing through narrow alleys. Smell soy and charcoal drifting from taverns. Somewhere, a retired samurai might be reciting poems about loyalty long after loyalty lost its meaning. Somewhere else, a merchant counts coins by starlight, pretending eat. It's just another prayer bead. It's calm. It's safe. It's slightly surreal. A country that banished chaos and accidentally discovered introspection. Hey again! The battlefield smoke is long gone now. The cannons are silent. The rivers around Osaka run clear again, carrying only stories. We've drifted past the wars and the long calm that followed, and tonight we wade into what always comes next. How nations remember, how they rewrite the noise of history into the melody of legend. Because when you can tell in the disaster, you have two options. Forget it, or turn it into poetry. Japan, as usual, chose the poetic route. Osaka's defeat could have remained a cautionary tale about ambition, pride, and overconfidence. But it didn't. Instead, something almost mystical happened during the long Tokugawa twilight. The story of the Toyotomi clan stopped being political and became emotional. Hideyoshi, the peasant who rose to rule, turned into a larger-than-life symbol. His son, Hideyori, transformed from political casualty into tragic heir, and the men who died with him, the last loyalists, became eternal figures of romantic loyalty. You see this process in every culture. The losing side eventually becomes the one that tugs at the heartstrings, maybe because the winners are too busy administrating taxes to inspire bedtime stories. The Toyotomi became folk icons, a quiet protest preserved in drama and art. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the story of Osaka was regularly adapted into bunraku puppet plays and later kabuki performances. These were not straightforward they were dramas dressed in metaphor, smuggling emotional truth past political censors. In these plays, Tokugawa authority was usually disguised. The villains wore different names. The rebels fought under new banners, but everyone in the audience understood what they were watching, a memory being kept alive under the polite fiction of performance. Every time a puppet of Sanada Yukimura fell heroically in battle, the theater hummed with quiet defiance. The tragedy of Osaka Castle also became romanticized visually. Artists made woodblock prints showing the fortress engulfed in mythic flames, with women and warriors standing calm in impossible poise. Painters froze the chaos into symmetry because what art does, it makes the unbearable beautiful enough to look at. Some prints even softened the brutality entirely. Osaka appeared pristine, untouched by war, surrounded by blossoms instead of smoke. That wasn't denial. It was memory lacquered with nostalgia. It's easier to remember glory than futility. And as the real city grew under Tokugawa peace, Osaka slowly became something opposite of its past, a merchant hub. Pragmatic, bustling, utterly detached from its old royal blood. The people there sold fabric, rice, poetry books, anything except rebellion. They still told the old stories, but quietly, over sake after dark, in the back rooms of tea houses, where only sympathy, not politics, survived. Let's float closer to the edge of the 19th century. Western historians often look at Japan's closing centuries before modernization and call them static. But inside that stillness, something delicate was happening, a conversation between memory and forgetting. Publicly, Osaka's defeat symbolized the triumph of peace. Privately, it whispered about what was lost. The Japanese even coined subtle phrases for this feeling. Mona no where, the sadness within beauty, the ache of It was exactly that emotion Osaka left behind. A reminder that perfection, onse achieved, only exists long enough to be destroyed. Writers captured that mood in Small Tristezza Geno, sighing at plum blossoms. A poet remarking how the past drifts downstream, unashamed. The layers of reflection built until the event stopped being about politics or war. It became a meditation on time itself. Then came modernity. The Meiji Restoration in 1868 toppled the Tokugawa regime, and Japan, after sleeping through centuries, suddenly bolted upright, industrializing, militarizing, westernizing all at once. Old castles turned into military bases or museums. Samurai vanished into pensioners or politicians. For a brief moment, the fury of ambition returned, this time disguised as progress. Yet old stories didn't die. In fact, they revived. Modern Japan needed roots to explain its new identity, so it dug up its own fables like archaeological artifacts. Plays and prints about Osaka's fall were suddenly republished as moral relics, proof that loyalty and sacrifice were eternal Japanese virtues. Hideyoshi's myth evolved again, from folk hero to nationalist symbol, from symbol to historical icon. Museums canonized him as the great unifier. His failures, like launching disastrous invasions of Korea, mostly edited out or explained as heroic overreach. History, it turns out, ages more gracefully than humans. In the 20th century, Osaka's ruins were rebuilt completely. The modern Osaka castle you can visit today isn't original, but it doesn't pretend to be. It's steel and concrete under decorative skin, reconstructed during the 1930s as a monument to national pride. Inside, elevators hum, where once staircases creaked. Tour guides point to panoramic windows where cannons once roared. It's hauntingly clean. Standing on its upper deck, you can see the entire city, sprawling outward glass towers, highways, neon veins. Somewhere beneath the asphalt lie the bones of that final siege. But even that thought feels distant now, abstract. Osaka has remade itself so many times that memory here feels like an echo bouncing between layers of soundproof history. Still, every few decades, Japan rediscovers its fascination with the siege of Osaka through television dramas, historical novels, video games even. Each generation reinvents the story it needs. Sometimes it's about tragic loyalty. Sometimes it's about the futility of resistance. Sometimes it's just aesthetic melancholy, a chance to stare at painted armor under mist-like mood music. It's almost poetic how the legacy of a failed family became one of national endurance. Tokugawa's victory built order, but Toyotomi's fall built conscience. You can't live forever on control alone. You need memory to make that control meaningful. In that sense, both sides eventually won, one with power, the other with permanence. Art did what armies never could. It reconciled contradiction. In Kabuki, the Toyotomi rebels die, but they do so beautifully enough that their defeat seems sacred. The Tokugawa peace lasts, but it feels haunted. That's the emotional circle. Japan built for itself a reflection too symmetrical to break. Sometimes you wonder what Hideyori or his mother Yotojimi would think if they could stand in the restored castle now. Would they find comfort in the quiet, or rage at the tidiness of it? All the way their deaths have been polished into moderate tragedy. Maybe they'd feel what everyone feels when history smooths the edges of pain, torn between pride that someone remembered and disbelief at how gentle the memory has become. The fire that once devoured Osaka is now a flicker behind museum glass. It doesn't burn anymore. It just glows softly in documentaries and art books as bedtime history for the modern age. The last irony, of course, is that Tokugawa Ieyasu, architect of control also, ended up sanctified. His shrines stand serene under mountains, visited by silent crowds. People light incense for the man who made peace from ashes, unaware that his greatest rival lies immortal in legend, just a few hundred miles away through the stories he tried to erase. Time forgives everyone. Eventually, through centuries, Japanese history has perfected that balance. Every defeat becomes beauty. Every victor turns patient ghost. The siege of Osaka, stripped of its smoke and screams, now lives as rhythm, rise, fall, and reflection. The kind of story you can whisper on a quiet night without fear it'll wake the dead. So here, as the night fades, imagine the last ember in that longhouse brazier, the faint scent of tatami and soot. Picture Osaka's walls, gleaming faintly in the first gray light of morning, empty of soldiers, full of silence. A piece so complete it feels almost unreal. A memory so delicate it hums when touched. The fire's gone out. History's asleep again, and in that soft darkness, where everything finally slows down, you can almost hear the ghosts of 1615 whisper a single truth. Nothing ever really ends. It just forgets how to shout. Hey guys, tonight we're gliding back to the edge of the ancient world, where dust turns gold and ambition outlives the body. Dim the lights, let your mind slow down, and picture this: a vast palace in Babylon, filled with perfume, wine, and men trying very hard not to look terrified of their boss. The boss, of course, is Alexander the Great, 32 years old, undefeated on the battlefield, and somehow already old enough to feel haunted by his own success. We're not here for the victories, though. You know those, the lightning conquests, the elephants, the burning of cities that probably smelled like regret and charcoal. Tonight, weary, walking with him through the quiet part of his story, when the battles are over. The dust has settled, and the mind that once conquered continents starts turning on itself, because by 323 BCE, Alexander isn't the Great anymore. He's just tired, and Babylon, with its gardens and ghosts, will soon become his final address. First, let's set the stage properly. Babylon in spring is beautiful in a way that feels slightly fake. The Euphrates slides lazily under bright skies, the city hums with trade and gossip, and Alexander, newly back from India, treats it like the universe's reward for 7 years of non-stop warfare. The Persian palaces have become his wedding halls, his hospitals, his therapy rooms. The marble floors echo with the footsteps of generals wearing too many medals. The air is heavy with oil, lamps, and roses. Soldiers wander in daisies, wondering when the glory part of conquest actually starts to feel restful. Alexander walks among them like a myth that hasn't decided whether to end heroically or tragically. His old injury scars ache. His liver probably hates him. He keeps drinking anyway. Wine diluted with just enough water to seem civilized. When his physicians caution restraint, he laughs and tells them the gods aren't jealous of the sober. Which, in hindsight, sounds like something a man on borrowed time would say. It's been 12 long years since he left Macedonia. 12 years, from the teenage prince who outwitted philosophers to the 30-something god king who's conquered more square miles than anyone alive. He's seen deserts swallow armies, seen elephants crush his men in India, seen his dearest friend Hephaestion die, which, if we're honest, might have been the real collapse of his empire. Hephaestion's death left him brittle. The ancient sources paint their relationship with careful ambiguity, because ancient biographers wrote in polite metaphors when they meant something human, but whether brother, comrade, or soulmate. Hephaestion was the person Alexander trusted most, and after his fevered death in Ecbatana, Alexander was different. He built enormous pyres. He ordered temples built in his honor. He even executed the physician he blamed for the illness. That's not grief. That's power disintegrating into ritual. The conqueror who'd crossed the Himalayas suddenly couldn't cross his own emotions. Things went cold after that. So by the time he arrives in Babylon, Alexander's outward glory masks the quiet panic underneath. The city welcomes him like a returning god. Banners wave, musicians play, courtiers throw flower petals, all very festive, which is to say, exhausting. He still plans new campaigns, because what else is there to do? He talks about invading Arabia next, finishing the world, as if there's still a corner left uncolored on his map. His generals nod politely, pretending it's realistic. Secretly, they're dreading it. Half of them are broke, half are traumatized, and all of them know from experience that one more campaign means at least 3 more years of sweating in deserts, while their king philosophizes under a parasol. But Alexander's restlessness won't stop. He wants to reach the edges of the known world. Maybe because the map is filling up faster than his purpose is. The more he conquers, the smaller existence feels. Meanwhile, Babylon tries to keep up with him. It's a center of everything. Priests reciting star charts. Greek officials rewriting tax ledgers in languages they can barely pronounce. Royal guests from every province wearing incompatible hats. It's an empire trying to translate itself into meaning. At the heart of it all is Alexander's new private world. A palace that smells like cedar and olive oil filled with foreign queens, aging generals and rows of exotic animals, eating better than most of his soldiers. He's recently married Roxana, his fiery Sogdian wife, who reportedly carried a dagger to dinner just to make sure no rival got too comfortable. Around her hover other wives, Statera and Parethetes, daughters of Persian royalty from earlier political marriages. It's a royal court as confusing as it is tense, a fragile collection of alliances held together by one man's charm and reputation. Charm, however, fades quicker than victories. Physically, Alexander's health has been slipping for months. Ancient chroniclers describe his constant fevers, his coughing fits, his sunburned skin from years of exposure, and his endless drinking. His friends claim he drank to dull the migraines. His officers claim he drank to dull the politics. Both are probably right. Yet somehow, he keeps working. Delegates from the far corners of his empire arrive daily, presenting tribute and requests, documents written in a dozen scripts. He reviews them by lamplight, his temper flickering when translations falter. Sometimes he snaps at old comrades. Sometimes he apologizes later, walking barefoot into their tents under the moon, because Alexander still believes he's fair, just misunderstood. One night, he invites his officers to a grand banquet held in honor of a sacral cleansing before his Arabian campaign. Everyone drinks far too much. The late spring air is warm, fragrant with date wine and smoke. Someone challenges him to a drinking contest because, apparently, no one ever learns not to. Alexander accepts, because of course he does. He wins. As usual, the winning just means drinking until his body begs for sleep. He makes it back to his quarters, pale and sweating. The fever begins before dawn. Days follow in fragments. Different ancient writers tell it differently, but they agree on the drift fever one day, weakness the next, and then the slow erasure of strength. His doctors surround him, murmuring theories in Greek and Persian. Some say malaria, others food poisoning, others still whisper poison because humanity loves blaming politics when pathogens are too boring. He drifts in and out of consciousness. The generals visit daily, standing awkwardly at his bedside like schoolboys at a funeral. When asked who should inherit, he supposedly murmurs something about giving his empire to the strongest, which, of course, solves nothing and guarantees centuries of violence. At some point they bring him to the Great Hall, propped on cushions, so the soldiers outside can file past and see him still breathing. An army of ghosts pays final tribute, men who vive marched from Macedonia to India and back, now weeping quietly because they have no idea what comes next. Alexander can no longer speak. He acknowledges them with a faint nod, his eyes sunken but somehow still fierce. Then he's carried back to his chamber, where Babylon's air grows thick and static. He dies on June 10th or 11th, 323 BCE, or doesn't, if you ask the rumors. Some say his body didn't decay for days, proving divine parentage. Others say he only appeared dead, perilous, while still conscious, trapped inside his famous legend. It's a fittingly absurd ending for someone who never quite separated myth from flesh. And that's how the empire fractures. The moment he's gone, the conquering machine starts shaking itself apart. His generals Adiadoshi. The successors begin, arguing almost before his body cools. Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, Cassanderich quietly unfolds. His own ambition, Roxana, pregnant with his heir, suddenly becomes both royal widow and political currency. Women vanish from the record quickly, but their actions ripple across the next decades. One by one, they die or disappear in the inevitable wars of succession. Meanwhile, Babylon itself sinks back into its own rhythm. The conqueror it hosted becomes another chapter, another set of walls haunted by dreams too large to last. Dust settles over the courtyards, servants leave. In the city sighs back to trade and astrology, its two favorite pastimes. But in the strange way history always works. Alexander does not go away. His empire splits into pieces: Egypt, Syria, Persia, Macedon, but his myth multiplies. Generals become kings, using his name as currency. Artists carve him as a god with lion curls and perfect calm. Poets rewrite his life until even failure looks glorious. The boy who once wept because there were no worlds left to conquer now rules them differently, through marble and story. Babylon becomes his tomb but never his cage. And somewhere beyond all this noise, his unmarked body, preserved in honey or myth, continues its slow journey westward, carried by men who probably never stopped worrying he might wake up. Let's stop here for a breath. The torches in Babylon have burned down to whispers. The conqueror lies quiet beneath gauze and perfume. Outside, night presses against the garden walls, and the frogs begin their small indifferent chorus. An empire Tomorrow, his generals will start carving the world. Tomorrow, someone will rename a city for him again, thinking it makes them immortal. But tonight, silence. The man who wanted eternity has found it, resting for once in a city built by others, under stars that never cared who owned the earth below them. Hey there again! The chamber in Babylon has gone cold. The conqueror sleeps. His captains have scattered, and the dust of his empire hangs heavy in the wind like something unsure whether to settle. Tonight, we re-drifting forward past the noise of swords and the smell of campfires into what came after. A world remade by one man's ambition, and then quietly rearranged by everyone else's survival instinct. This is the Hellenistic age, that drifting, restless century or two after Alexander's death, when no one really ruled the world, but everyone pretended they did. The empires he carved cracked apart into elaborate mosaics, each piece still gleaming with a trace of Greek light. If the story so far has been war and fever, this part is the echo. Art, cities, experiments, and philosophy trying to find meaning in the empire's ruins. Let's start, as usual, with geography and resentment. B300 BCE, Alexander's generals, the Dearochi, those self-declared heirs of chaos, have successfully turned unity into a memory. The east goes to Seleucus, the west to Cassander, Egypt to Ptolemy, and everything else distributes itself along the fault lines of stubbornness. It's like dividing the remains of a god and calling that stability. But even in fragments, the empire doesn't die. Greek soldiers settle in Syria, Afghanistan, and Egypt. They build gymnasiums beside Zoroastrian temples, carve statues of Athena next to local gods, and name everything Alexandria until cartographers give up. The result is something fascinating. A world suddenly talking to itself in multiple languages. The Greeks bring their architecture and their alphabet. The locals bring their astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Together they create something no single empire ever managed. Cross-pollination disguised as empire management. Take Egypt, under Ptolemy, the most stable of Alexander's successors. He's pragmatic to the point of genius. While everyone else wastes time conquering things they can't hold, he builds infrastructure, taxes gently, and starts collecting knowledge like a hobby. Under his rule, Alexandria becomes the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean. Picture it. Marble colonnades fading into the sea mist, carts rattling down wide streets, scribes whispering in a dozen dialects. The great library, begun under Ptolemy's reign, grows into a symbol of curiosity itself. Thousands of scrolls, Greek, Egyptian, Babylonian, Persian, line the shelves. Scholars debate philosophy beside mathematicians who accidentally invent geometry while arguing about wine prices. It's said that ships docking in Alexandria were searched for manuscripts as eagerly as for cargo. Captains had their books confiscated, copied, and sometimes never returned. It was a quiet empire built not on tribute or blood, but on information theft disguised as intellectual generosity. The Ptolemies also refined the art of royal image control. They present themselves as pharaohs to the Egyptians, and Hellenistic monarchs to the Greeks. Their portraits show them in Egyptian crowns, with Greek inscriptions, careful hybrids of symbolism. Even religion becomes a political experiment. The new god Serapis merges Greek and Egyptian elements, a divine compromise as practical as it is confusing, and presiding over it all, the original Ptolemy slowly transforms from soldier to scholarking, writing his own history of Alexander that will serve as the foundation for future legends. He understands better than anyone that whoever narrates history chooses which shade of immortality the dead receive. Further east, Seleucus does something equally bizarre. He builds cities in the middle of emptiness. Seleucia the Tigris rises on the ghost of Babylon, becoming a miniature Greece in Mesopotamia. Antioch appears in Syria, a sun-bright hybrid of Greek grid planning and Eastern ornament. These are not colonies. They're memorials. Every Seleucid ruler seems convinced he's continuing Alexander's vision by renaming geography. Inside those walls, Greek colonists marry locals, teach their children multiple languages, and occasionally forget their own. Greek statues wear Persian shoes, local astronomers learn geometry in Greek, and write horoscopes in Aramaic. For a world born of decline, it's remarkably creative. If the classical Greek world was a stage for heroes, the Hellenistic world is a studio for thinkers. Let's float through a few lives of the period, quieter ones, equally epic in their own way. In Syracuse, Euclid compiles his elements, that maddeningly perfect collection of geometric principles. He writes in the calm tone of someone who has never been to war. In Pergamon, sculptors carve realistic bodies that twist and ache, human forms stripped of divinity, much more honest about gravity. Somewhere in Alexandria, a man named Eratosthenes leans over his instruments, calculates the circumference of the earth, and hits astonishingly close to the truth. And in that same city, women begin to appear in the scholarly record, faintly, like sparks in fog. There's Hypatia centuries later, of course, but also early mathematicians and physicians who worked quietly under Ptolemaic patronage. Courts might no longer boast conquerors, but they host minds, reshaping what it meant to be human. It's as if Alexander's restless energy didn't stop at his death. It simply shifted from conquest outward to inquiry inward. Meanwhile, the Greeks, back in the old homeland, look at all this and sigh. Athens becomes a quiet intellectual backwater, content to philosophize about ethics while everyone else trades silk and spices. The schools of Plato and Aristotle survive mostly as memory museums. Greek citizens debate happiness, while their descendants in Asia debate astronomy. The irony is rich. The conqueror's homeland shrinks in influence, just as the world grows fluent in their culture. The language of trade across the eastern Mediterranean becomes Greek, spoken with accents from Egypt to Bactria. Even people who never met a Macedonian know how to gossip about the gods in Attic rhythm. Empire, it turns out, survives as grammar long after borders vanish. By the 2nd century BCE, time begins to erode even these great fragments. The Seleucid realm weakens under its own geography. Too vast, too mixed, too tired. Provinces rebel, new kingdoms bloom like weeds in the cracks. In the west, Ptolemaic Egypt drifts into decadence, silken robes heavier than their treasury. It's here, centuries later, that Cleopatra will finally reappear, the last echo of that Macedonian dynasty pretending to be pharaohs. Her story, all glamour, wit, and terrible diplomacy, will close the Hellenistic curtain and hand the stage to Rome. But that's still far off in our night. For now, the old structure holds, shimmering like a soap bubble about to burst. Still, even decay can be graceful. The Hellenistic kingdoms don't collapse into barbarism. They fade into Rome like a candle quietly snuffed out and relit by someone else's hand. The Romans, practical as ever, take what's left, the libraries, the architecture, depiosopy, and merge it into their own structure of control. Even the Greek gods get Roman aliases, as if time itself is playing translation games. When Roman generals finally march into Alexandria, they find a city whose marble has already absorbed 1,000 fingerprints. They don't destroy it. They simply rename pieces of it, write new laws, and copy its libraries for their own senators to misunderstand later. History's rhythm remains reliable. Conquer, reorganize, inherit, repeat, and Alexander, still there. Somehow, everywhere yet nowhere. His image adorns coins across multiple kingdoms, each depicting him differently. In Egypt, he's serene, like a sun god. In Bactria, rugged and bearded. In Macedon, forever youthful, because the homeland preferred to remember its golden boy, not the feverish king of Babylon. He becomes less human, more metapore lesson, a warning, a prototype. Philosophers use him to discuss fortune and folly. Kings quote him as if proximity to his name makes their crowns fit tighter. Even lovers and poets borrow him, the conqueror with restless eyes, marching endlessly across human imagination. The real empire was never his borders. It was this afterlife of admiration and envy, threaded through centuries. If you could stand on the Acropolis of Antioch at twilight, around 250 BCE, you'd see something Alexander might have wished for. The horizon glows amber, temples reflect both Greek geometry and Mesopotamian color, and the voices below speak 5 languages at once. Merchants shout prices, philosophers argue about ethics, priests chant under somewhere, children are learning to write their names in 2 alphabets. That mixture, chaotic, alive, self-contradictory, is his true empire. Not one united under command, but one connected through curiosity. It's messy, imperfect, a little drunk on its own brilliance, but very much alive. So as the centuries slide into Rome's shadow, the Hellenistic world settles into the foundation of Western identity. Its mathematics shapes architecture. Its stories shape morality. Its restlessness stays in our species like an inherited heartbeat. For a man who died young in humid Babylon, Alexander's reach becomes almost eternal, not through conquest, but through the curiosity his chaos inspired. Let's pause here for breath. The bronze statues shine under low light. The libraries hum softly, With papyrus dust, the world he tore apart rebuilds itself in 1,000 hybrid forms. The conqueror sleeps, the ideas wander, and out beyond the edge of empire, in lands he never touched. People will soon whisper his name in new tongues. Iskandar Sikanda Skandarbeg reshaped, but always half. Divined the dream of a man who refused to stay home. Hey again. The lamps have burned low in Babylon. Alexander is Gornor. So they think. The most powerful man on earth has left behind no will. No clear air, only whispers and the faint scent of incense in a room that suddenly feels much too big. What happens next is what always happens when a leader dies too young and too Everyone smiles politely and immediately starts planning to stab each other in the political sense. At first, so tonight, we drift through the quiet chaos that followed. The candles are guttering, the generals are pretending to grieve, and somewhere outside the palace, soldiers are already picking sides. When Alexander's breath finally stops, Babylon goes unnaturally still. His body, reportedly undecayed for days, becomes a relic before anyone knows what to do with it. His officers gather in the great audience hall room, too full of ambition for comfort. There are at least a dozen men who believe they deserve everything. Ptolemy, clever and pragmatic. Seleucus, patient and calculating. Antigonus, old, ruthless, and not fond of losing. And then there's Perdiccas, the man Alexander supposedly trusted to manage his empire until the next ruler was chosen. Unfortunately, he takes that trust a bit too seriously. Perdiccas declares himself regent for the unborn son of Alexander and Roxana, as if that settles everything. It does not. The army murmurs objections. The other generals cross their arms, and within days, what was once the most efficient military machine in Asia becomes a group project, with no leader and too many opinions. The first argument, naturally, is about the body. Where should Alexander be buried? The Macedonians want him returned home, to Aegea, the royal tombs of his ancestors. The Persian faction suggests he belongs at Babylon after all. He claimed to be divine, and gods live where the world begins and ends. Perdiccas, never one for subtlety, announces that the body will be entombed in Egypt. Why Egypt? Good question. No one actually knows, but some scholars guess he planned a new capital there. Or maybe because Egypt was loyal, predictable, and warm enough to mummify things naturally. Whatever the reason, this choice stirs everyone's paranoia. Babylon's priests grumble. The generals glare. The soldiers mutter that gods don't need shipping instructions. And somewhere quietly in the background, Ptolemy, the man who knows an opportunity when he sees one, prepares to make his move. Before the body leaves, though, politics begins its slow implosion. The generals pretend to govern jointly, because pretending is easier than agreeing. Territories are divided like ill-fitting furniture. Antipater stays behind in Macedonia to keep the Greeks under control. Perdiccas takes command in the east. Ptolemy gets Egypt, which everyone assumes is a minor assignment, a quiet, dusty province where he can't cause much trouble. This will prove to be a spectacular miscalculation. Seleucus receives a command in Babylon itself, which means he's technically at the center of the known world, but trapped under everyone's scrutiny. Antigonus, the oldest of the group, receives the western provinces enough to feel respected, not enough to be satisfied. It's like watching a family divide an estate when no one really cares about the furniture. They just want each other to fail. Meanwhile, Alexander's mother Olympias is still alive back in Macedonia. And that is as good as saying the world remains slightly cursed. Olympias spent decades believing her son was semi-divine, possibly fathered by Zeus himself, depending on which myth you asked her to repeat. She's fierce, eloquent, and terrifying. The remaining Macedonian nobles tiptoe around her because she's both the king's mother and the scariest person they've ever met. When she hears her son's empire is cracking, she declares herself guardian of his unborn heir, Alexander IV, who Roxana soon brings into the world. It's a victory for legitimacy in paper. In practice, the baby king becomes a live grenade. Everyone plans to control, but no one intends to cradle for long. Back in Babylon, Perdiccas is learning that regency is about as glamorous as plague management. His attempts at diplomacy mostly involve forcing generals to obey him under vague threats. When they resist, Aelus is out executing those who look unenthusiastic and alienating almost everyone who mattered. Ptolemy, comfortably distant in Egypt, watches this unfolding mess with something like relief. He fortifies Alexandria, the new city, named after their late Singan, quietly recruits mercenaries. He has no illusions about empire-wide rule. He just wants his own corner, stable and self-sufficient. Ironically, he will succeed best. By 321 BCE, things collapse outright. Perdiccas, desperate to prove his supremacy, leads an ill-fated campaign into Egypt to crush his supposed subordinate. The result, his army mutinies mid-river. His officers murder him in his tent, and Ptolemy greets the assassins with wine. Egypt stays independent. Another one down, 9 to go. In Macedon, Olympias becomes increasingly unpredictable. She sends letters demanding loyalty, threatening rebellion, and occasionally performing sacrifices large enough to make her contemporaries nervous. Everyone respects her heritage, but would rather she stop talking about divine destiny quite so often. Roxana and her child remain under guard for their own protection, which mostly means imprisonment in luxury. The boy, Alexander IV, grows up surrounded by soldiers and tutors who remind him daily that he's important but powerless. Gods and men rarely retire gracefully. Within a decade of the conqueror's death, the map looks unrecognizable. Generals fight over Asia, Phoenicia, and Anatolia, like guests at a wedding gone wrong. Cities once named for Alexander multiply until even the clerks lose count. Battles start with formal declarations and end with inconvenient drownings. Seleucus eventually escapes Babylon and re-emerges years later to form the Seleucid Empire in the east, a sprawling state that will endure for centuries even as it collapses repeatedly under its own administration. Ptolemy's Egypt becomes a haven for scholars, traders, and opportunists, laying the groundwork for the glittering city of Alexandria, where the lighthouse and its library will guard all the knowledge the empire once ignored. And the old general with unshakable energy tries to reunify everything. For a while, he almost succeeds. His armies win again and again, reminding the world that Macedonian ambition hasn't gone extinct, but the wheel always turns. Antigonus dies in battle, hit by a catapult stone at 81 ironically, one of the few men in this entire saga who dies with weapon in hand. As the decades slide by, Alexander's legend grows while his empire shrinks. Philosophers debate whether he was divine or merely lucky. Greek historians romanticize him as the perfect synthesis of courage and wit. Eastern scribes incorporate him into Persian and later Arabic tales as a wise world emperor who conversed with prophets and subdued monsters, Terial Manis. Invisible now? Buried under centuries of idealism. The generals who loved him, envied him, or feared him become myths too, wearing borrowed halos from their master's afterglow. It's strange how conquest always ends the same way. Reality dissolves, stories remain. But there's one story worth lingering on the tail of his body's journey. Around 321 BCE. While Perdiccas is still technically alive, the golden hearse carrying Alexander's remains begins its slow march west from Babylon. The hearse itself is absurd. Gilded columns, jewel-encrusted roof, statues of lions and suns, drawn by 64 mules in ornate harnesses, practically a moving temple. It never reaches Macedon. Ptolemy intercepts the procession near Syria, claiming politely that Egypt is the rightful resting place. The escort doesn't argue. They follow him south to Memphis first, then later to Alexandria, where the body becomes a centerpiece for the new dynasty's legitimacy. Generations will visit the mausoleum there, staring at what they believe is the preserved gift. Tucked neatly in glass and myth, eventually the trace of the tomb vanishes, lost beneath centuries of reconstruction, earthquakes, and time. Archaeologists still search for it today, moving through sand and rumor as if chasing a mirage. For all his effort to own the world, Alexander's final address remains missing, which feels oddly appropriate. By the time his heirs finish fighting, no one remembers why they started. The great Idozunaiting, east and west, blending cultures, founding a universal emperor reduced to bureaucratic routines and arguments over coinage. And yet, something quietly survives. Greek art spreads across Asia. Cities retain Greek columns, but adopt Persian colors. Egyptian priests still chant hymns rewritten with Greek names. Out of the ashes of infighting rises a new cultural fusion, the Hellenistic age, where science, philosophy, and architecture bloom like late flowers after the storm. Alexander wanted eternity. What he got was diffusion, his name, scattered through languages, his reflections surviving in the faces of scholars, kings, and dreamers who never saw Babylon, but still felt its gravity. So if you walked through that city, a century later, under Seleucid rule, you might still hear merchants invoking his name to bless a deal or captains whispering Iskandar to the sea before sailing. Babylon no longer cared who ruled her, but she remembered the fevered Macedonian who once looked at her skies and saw everything he still wanted. And somewhere, under layers of dust and longing, maybe the soil still remembers the echo of sandal steps, and a voice murmuring about the ends of the earth. Let's pause here a moment. The battles are over again, the map redrawn, the legends in motion. The conqueror's body lies somewhere, uncertain, his mind scattered across libraries and myths. Tomorrow, new kings will rise, pretending to finish what he began. Tomorrow, philosophers will quote him incorrectly. Tomorrow, the story continues without him, as it always does. But tonight, Babylon is quiet again. The Euphrates moves lazily under the stars. The palace corridors smell faintly of myrrh and dust. And far away, maybe in some forgotten crypt under Alexandria, a shadow of Alexander the Great continues to rescind, moved, undefeated, and still listening. Hey again. We've traveled far tonight. Past battlefields turned to dust. Past cities renamed out of habit. All the way into the soft haze of legend. The man who died in Babylon has now been dead for more than 2,000 years. But this part of the story never really ends, because Alexander didn't just conquer nations, he conquered imagination. Tonight, we float through the long afterlife of his name. How he moved from map to myth, how poets, priests, and kings reassembled him into something like a moral lesson wrapped in adventure, and how his story survived long after facts gave up. It starts simply enough. As most legends do with what people want to believe, the soldiers who lived through his campaigns return home, telling stories heavy with exaggeration. They talked about a man who faced fire-breathing elephants and walked into storms of arrows untouched. They describe a deathless warrior blessed by the gods, whose body didn't rot, whose eyes never closed. The retellings travel faster than his armies ever did. Within a generation, Alexander's memory stops belonging to history altogether. The Greeks call him Megas Alexandros, the great Alexander, as if the adjective alone could stave off mortality. But everywhere else, his image starts taking new shapes. In Egypt, the priests whisper he was the son of Amun, the great god of the desert, and that lightning itself marked his birth. In Persia, storytellers fold him into local myths about world kings blessed by the heavens, and in lands he never saw. India, Central Asia, his name becomes shorthand for courage mixed with just a bit of madness. By the 3rd century BCE, he's gone from hero to template. Every general imitates his haircut. Every ruler claims to be his successor. He's not just history, he's marketing. Fast forward a few centuries. The Mediterranean world has changed masters again. Rome now rules where he once camped. The emperors of Rome admire him and quietly envy him. Julius Caesar, visiting a statue of Alexander in Spain, reportedly wept because at the same age he had done nothing memorable. Augustus adopted the imagery of divine kingship straight from Macedonian propagandistan discs behind his head, heroic nudity carved in chilled marble. Even ordinary Roman soldiers told stories about Alexander while drinking in faraway forts. He'd become shorthand for boundless ambition, the kind that conquers everything except peace of mind. It's strange how ancient empires recycle their idols, but Alexander fit perfectly. His life had everything. Youth, victory, beauty, tragedy. He was complicated enough to mean whatever you needed him to mean. As the centuries rolled on, his myth began crossing languages and faiths. The Greeks gave him to the Romans. The Romans passed him to the Persians. The Persians handed him to the Arab. Each version altered his soul slightly, dressing him in new beliefs, but keeping that same restless heartbeat at the core. By late antiquity, a fantastic text began circulating, the Alexander Romance. It wasn't history. It was fan fiction with divine aspirations. In it, Alexander travels beyond India into oceans of mystery, builds walls against demons, and searches for the water of life. He meets philosophers, prophets, and monsters. He becomes less a conqueror than an explorer of the human condition. The story mutates with every translation. Greek to Latin, Syriac to Persian, Persian to Arabic, and somewhere in that long journey, Alexander stops being Greek altogether. The Muslims of the early Islamic world knew him as Iskandar du al-Qarni, the two-horned one. The horns weren't devilish, but symbolic, a sign of divine power borrowed from the iconography of Ammon. In the Quran, this Iskandar is no conqueror at all, but a righteous ruler, a servant of God who travels to the ends of the earth to bring justice. Babylon's feverish king has transformed into a moral pilgrim. It asked one of history, as quieter miracles, how a man who built his name on destruction became remembered as a builder of purpose. Through the Middle Ages, the Alexander story spread along trade routes, tucked between carpets and spices. In the Byzantine Empire, he turns up in mosaics riding a winged chariot to heaven. In medieval Europe, it becomes a Christian knight avant la lettre, slaying dragons and consulting oracles. French poets sing of him as a mirror for princely virtue. In Central Asia, Persian poets call him Iskandar-i Zulm, half hero, half caution-proof, that even the greatest fall to pride. Every culture keeps the parts it likes and quietly erases the rest. That's how immortality works. It's editing, not eternity. By the 13th century, there are paintings of Alexander flying through the sky in a contraption pulled by In one, he's staring up toward heaven. In another, looking down at earth with regret. Same man, different morals. It is hard not to think he'd have liked that. Onse wept because there were no worlds left to conquer, and now he's conquered imagination itself. When you step into Renaissance Europe, Alexander returns again, this time as a model of human curiosity. Scholars rediscover Greek texts, and suddenly he's no longer saint or myth, but the perfect example of worldly genius. Artists carve him gazing upward, face half-lit, caught between divine ambition and exhaustion. Machiavelli drops his name as shorthand for princely willpower. Painters surround him with allegories of temperance he never actually practiced. In the 18th and 19th centuries, empire builders in Europe and Asia resurrect him yet again, each claiming him as ancestral spirit of expansion. The British admire his logistics, the French, his vision, the Russians, his stubbornness. Even Napoleon styles himself as a new Alexander, the same theatrical charm, the same ruinous arrogance, the same fascination with being remembered. But for ordinary people, Alexander lived on more quietly. In fairy tales, proverbs, and geographies of wonder. Maps still carried his impossible walls, said to protect humanity from chaos beyond. Travelers insisted that in far northern mountains, the Great Wall of Iskandar still stood, keeping demons at bay. Some said it was built of iron, others imagined it as brass. No two stories agreed, but agreement was never the point. He'd become the symbol of what humans do with greatness. Once facts run out, they turn it into a mirror for every age, as streams. And yet, even now, we still chase him. Archaeologists in Alexandria dig through ruins trying to find his tomb. Historians argue over where he died, how he died, whether he died at all. Was it fever? Poison? Typhoid mixed with exhaustion? No one can prove it. Every decade adds new theories, new medical diagnoses he'd probably find irritating. Somewhere, his body, if it still exists, waits, under layers of stone and unintended irony, in a city named for him, under skies that no longer know his voice. But maybe that's fitting. The man who crossed every border left his own final mystery unclaimed. His shadow runs through history like a watermark. The idea that ambition can rewrite the map, that youth and brilliance can remake the world before breakfast and burn out by sunset, that a single person can imagine too much and still be loved for trying. Every conqueror afterward Caesar, Genghis Khan, Napoleon, even modern leaders dreaming in headline zens, walking through his outline, half copying, none of them quite touched that strange blend of genius and loneliness. Alexander's curse wasn't that he wanted too much, it was that he actually achieved it. And then, of course, had to ask, what now? If he could see how his story unfolded, he might laugh, or he might roll his eyes. The philosophers turned him into wisdom, the priests into piety, the romantics into tragedy. The historians called him reckless but necessary, the poets called him divine but doomed. Every version contradicts the next, but all hum the same refrain, that somewhere between glory and grief, the human spirit cracks open and shows what it can and shouldn't do. So, as we end this long, slow journey across his worlds, picture that last image you remember perhaps. The marble bust, eyes vacant, hair carved in impossible curls. Or maybe the fevered man in Babylon, raising a cup to a crowd of generals who already think of inheritance. Or perhaps the mythic Iskandar wandering deserts on camelback, asking prophets about the edges of creation. Pick whichever one you like best. He'd probably approve, because Alexander the Great didn't belong to one time, or one country, or even one idea. He belonged to the human need to keep telling stories that outlasts mortality. And in that sense, his ultimate conquest, the one he never planned, was across centuries, into memory itself. If you're still awake, that's all right. The river Euphrates is still gliding softly in your imagination, the stars hovering faintly above that old palace, the sound of distant soldiers fading into sand. The man who once called himself king of the world now drifts quietly into the dark, leaving only the echo of his name behind. Sleep easy under his empire of dreams. Tomorrow, history will wake again, but for tonight, it's enough just to let the legend rest.